What if I told you the world's first real express mail service was set up by the most feared warlord in history, the guy who burned entire cities to the ground? When you hear the name Genghis Khan, you probably think of unstoppable Mongol horsemen sweeping across Asia, leaving a trail of destruction behind them. And you'd be right. Genghis wasn't exactly the guy you'd invite to a peaceful Sunday brunch. He conquered more land than anyone else in human history, sometimes with brutal efficiency. But here's the plot twist. This same man who could terrify entire kingdoms cared deeply about one thing: getting a message from point A to point B as fast as humanly possible. Enter the yam. Not the sweet potato, but Genghis Khan's version of a postal service. This wasn't just a couple of messengers on horseback. It was an entire empire-wide communication network, with relay stations built about every 20 to 30 miles. Each station had fresh horses and riders ready to pass the message along like a high-speed relay race. Think of it as the Amazon Prime of the 13th century, but without the 2-day guarantee, obviously. Riders could travel more than 200 miles in a single day, which was lightning speed for the time. And it wasn't just for military orders either. Merchants, diplomats, and even travelers could use the system if they had official permission. This kept Genghis's empire connected from the steppes of Mongolia to the edge of Europe. For the first time in history, you could send news across thousands of miles without waiting months for it to arrive, and probably without losing your messenger to bandits along the way. This postal network made the Mongol Empire surprisingly stable for its size. Imagine trying to run the biggest land empire ever without being able to get messages where they need to go. It would be chaos. The yam allowed Genghis to coordinate military campaigns, enforce laws, collect taxes, and keep track of faraway governors who might be plotting rebellion. On top of that, it boosted trade along the Silk Road because merchants felt safer knowing they could communicate quickly and get protection if trouble popped up. In a weird way, Genghis Khan's communication obsession helps lay the groundwork for a more connected Eurasia. So yes, Genghis Khan did wipe out entire populations, but he also made sure your medieval newsletter got delivered on time. His postal system was so efficient that later empires copied the idea, and historians say it might have even inspired early European postal routes. Next time you complain about waiting 2 days for a package, just remember, the original same-day delivery guy was a Mongol horseman galloping through the night, courtesy of Genghis Khan.
Mongols. Here's something wild. The same empire known for leaving mountains of skulls outside conquered cities also made sure your bag of grain actually weighed what the seller claimed. The Mongols weren't just horse-riding conquerors. They were surprisingly obsessed with order. Once they had taken over a region, they wanted it to run smoothly, not just for their own convenience, but because a stable empire meant more tax money, and tax money meant more horses, more weapons, more everything. So Genghis Khan and his successors came up with an idea that seems super boring on the surface, but changed history. They standardized weights and measures across their massive empire. Picture this. You're a merchant trying to trade silk from China for spices from Persia. Before the Mongols, this was a nightmare. Every town had its own idea of what a pound or a gallon was, so you were constantly getting ripped off or wasting time recalculating your goods at every stop. The Mongols said, "Enough of that." They created a system where everyone in their territory used the same standards, so a sack of grain in Mongolia was measured the same way as a sack of grain in Russia. And they didn't just stop at weights and measures. They standardized coinage, too. They introduced paper money in some areas and made sure traders could actually trust it. That might sound obvious now, but in the 13th century, that was revolutionary. This meant that if you were a merchant, you could travel thousands of miles without constantly renegotiating exchange rates or wondering if the local weights were rigged against you. The result? Trade absolutely exploded. The Silk Road became safer and more profitable than it had been in centuries. Goods, ideas, and technology started flowing from east to west and vice versa. Chinese inventions like gunpowder and paper spread more easily, while things like Persian medical knowledge and European textiles traveled back the other way. You could argue that this was one of the first big steps toward what we now call globalization. And there's a sneaky brilliance here. By making trade easier, the Mongols made themselves richer, and they also made their subjects happier. A merchant who can trade fairly is less likely to rebel. A town that can sell its goods more widely is more loyal to the empire that protects its trade routes. It was both a clever business move and a clever political one. So, yeah, the Mongols might have been terrifying on the battlefield, but they also cared about making sure your spices were weighed correctly and your silver coins weren't fake. It's a weirdly wholesome side to one of the most feared empires in history. Next time you buy something by weight, thank the Mongols. They were the original quality control department of Eurasia.
Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar wasn't exactly known for playing nice. This was the guy who marched an army across the Rubicon and kicked off a civil war just to take control of Rome. He was ambitious, ruthless, and had no problem crushing anyone who got in his way. But here's the twist. Caesar also did something pretty radical for his time. He decided that people Rome conquered didn't have to stay outsiders forever. Back then, Roman citizenship was like an exclusive club. If you weren't born Roman, you didn't get the same rights. You couldn't vote, you couldn't hold office, and good luck getting a fair trial. Most conquerors throughout history have loved keeping the conquered at arm's length. But Caesar looked at Rome's growing empire and thought, you know what? Let's make these people part of the team. So he started granting citizenship to people from conquered territories. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It came with real perks. Suddenly, these former enemies could trade freely, own land under Roman law, and even work their way into political life if they were ambitious enough. It was like Rome saying, okay,
We beat you, but now we're going to make you one of us. This was a genius move for a couple of reasons. First, it made rebellion way less appealing. If you know your kids can grow up as full Romans, you're less likely to pick up a sword and fight. Second, it helped knit the empire together. Instead of being a patchwork of resentful provinces, Rome became more like a shared identity people could buy into, literally. Even people who weren't granted citizenship right away started to want it, which meant they had a reason to stay loyal. And let's be real, Caesar wasn't just being nice. He was building a power base. Every time he granted citizenship to a new group, he was creating future allies who would support him politically. Some historians even think this was one of the reasons the Roman elite turned against him. They didn't like the idea of outsiders getting a say in Roman politics. But whether or not it made the old guard squirm, it worked. Rome stayed stable and kept expanding, and eventually this policy paved the way for even more inclusivity. By the time of later emperors, citizenship was granted to almost everyone in the empire. So yeah, Julius Caesar might have been a power-hungry dictator, but he also opened the door for millions of people to stop being second-class subjects and start being full Romans. In a way, he made the empire less about where you were born and more about whether you were willing to join the Roman project. That's a surprisingly progressive idea for a guy whose usual solution to problems was send in the legions.
Augustus Caesar. Rome in the 1st century BCE was an absolute mess. The city was packed, chaotic, and built mostly of wood. Fires were basically a regular event. And by regular, I mean the kind of thing that could wipe out entire neighborhoods overnight. And crime? Forget about it. If you got mugged in a dark alley, good luck finding someone to help. Rome didn't have anything close to a police department. It was more like handle it yourself or hire some muscle. Then along came Augustus Caesar, the man who turned Rome from a crumbling republic into a stable empire. Augustus had a thing for order. He didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted it to run like a well-oiled machine. So he came up with a plan that sounds obvious now, but was groundbreaking back then. He created Rome's first fire brigade and police force. Let's start with the fire brigade. Augustus organized a group called the Vigiles, around 7,000 men split into cohorts who patrolled the streets at night. Their job? Put out fires before they burned half the city down. They had buckets, axes, and even early fire pumps. Think about that. This was 2,000 years ago, and Rome basically had firefighters on standby. They didn't just wait for trouble either. They acted as a kind of night watch, keeping an eye out for crime while they were at it. Which brings us to the police force. Augustus created what was essentially the first urban police department, called the Cohortes Urbanae. These guys kept order, broke up riots, and made sure crime didn't spiral out of control. If things got really bad, like a full-on gang war, Augustus even had the Praetorian Guard, his personal elite soldiers, ready to step in. This wasn't just about public safety. It was smart politics.
A city that's constantly burning down or rioting is a city that can't admire how great its emperor is. By creating these services, Augustus made everyday life more predictable and less terrifying. Ordinary Romans could go to sleep knowing someone was actually out there keeping an eye on things. That bought Augustus a ton of loyalty from the common people. And here's the part that's easy to miss. These changes turned Rome into a model for future cities. The idea that a government should have firefighters and police on the payroll started here. Fast forward a couple thousand years, and that's just part of how cities work. We expect it. So, yeah, Augustus might have been the guy who crushed Rome's democracy and turned himself into emperor, but he also made sure you didn't wake up to find your house reduced to ashes while someone stole your sandals. He gave Rome a taste of law, order, and public safety, and that's a legacy that stuck.
Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte is usually remembered for two things: conquering half of Europe and being really short, which, by the way, is kind of a myth. But let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention. The guy basically rewrote the rulebook for how modern legal systems work. Literally. Before Napoleon, French law was a mess. Each region had its own set of rules, some dating back to the Middle Ages. Imagine trying to do business or settle a dispute when the law changes every time you cross a river. It was confusing, inefficient, and unfair. Napoleon, being the control freak that he was, decided this wasn't good enough for his empire. He wanted one clear, consistent set of laws that everyone could follow. So he gathered some of the brightest legal minds of the time and created what became known as the Napoleonic Code. This wasn't just some minor tweak. It was a complete overhaul of French law. The code laid out clear rules about property rights, contracts, marriage, inheritance, all the big stuff that affects daily life. And here's the genius part. It was written to be simple and understandable, not just for lawyers, but for regular people. Napoleon wanted the law to be something you could actually know, not some mysterious thing only judges could interpret. The Napoleonic Code emphasized a few key ideas that were revolutionary at the time. Equality before the law, no more special privileges for the nobility, protection of property rights, and the idea that laws should be written down and accessible. That might sound obvious today, but back then it was a radical shift toward a more modern, rational system. And it worked. The code didn't just unify France, it spread wherever Napoleon's armies marched. Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, even places outside Europe ended up adopting versions of it. More than 200 years later, countries around the world, from Egypt to Japan to much of Latin America, still base parts of their legal systems on the Napoleonic Code. That's an insane level of influence for a guy best known for wearing a funny hat and getting exiled to an island. Of course, Napoleon had his flaws. He crowned himself emperor, waged wars that killed millions, and generally had a bit of an ego problem. But here's the thing. Most conquerors just leave behind chaos when they're gone. Napoleon left behind a legal framework that helped shape modern civilization. So the next time you sign a contract or argue over property rights, you can give a tiny nod to Napoleon Bonaparte. Sure, he may have tried to take over the world, but he also made sure the rules for running that world were a lot more fair and a lot easier to understand. Benito Mussolini. Benito Mussolini isn't exactly remembered as one of history's nice guys. The guy literally coined the term fascism, turned Italy into a dictatorship, and got very cozy with Hitler. Not a great resume. But here's the twist. Mussolini also did something that saved a lot of lives. He took on one of Italy's oldest and deadliest problems, the Pontine Marshes. The Pontine Marshes were this massive, swampy stretch of land about an hour southeast of Rome. For centuries, they were basically useless, too wet for farming, crawling with mosquitoes, and absolutely riddled with malaria. Roman emperors had tried to drain them. Medieval popes had tried to drain them. Every one failed. It was one of those unsolvable problems that people just learned to live with. Then Mussolini came along in the 1930s and decided that the marshes were going to be conquered, not by soldiers, but by engineers. Mussolini threw huge resources into the project. He brought in thousands of workers, built canals, pumped out water, and turned the marshes into farmland. Entire new towns were constructed on the reclaimed land, towns that are still there today, by the way. And most importantly, by eliminating the standing water, Mussolini effectively wiped out malaria in the region. This was a game changer for the locals. Whole generations had grown up expecting to get sick every summer, and suddenly the disease was basically gone. Now, this wasn't just Mussolini being generous. This was classic Mussolini propaganda. He used the project to show off how powerful and efficient his regime was. There were photos of him posing with shovels, wading into the mud, playing the role of the hands-on leader. But propaganda or not, the result was real. Fertile farmland, healthy communities, and thousands of lives saved. This project also became a model for public health efforts around the world. Other countries looked at what happened in the Pontine Marshes and thought, hey, maybe we can do that too. It inspired similar anti-malaria efforts in the US, South America, and parts of Africa. Of course, Mussolini being Mussolini, he eventually dragged Italy into World War II on the wrong side of history, which ended in disaster. But it's hard to deny that this particular project worked. He didn't just make a swamp go away. He turned it into a place where people could actually live, work, and raise families without fearing a mosquito bite. So yes, Mussolini was a dictator who made a lot of bad decisions, but he also proved that even the most terrifying leaders can sometimes do something that genuinely helps people. The Pontine Marshes stand as this strange little monument to that fact, a reminder that history's villains aren't always 100% villain. And sometimes the good they do sticks around longer than their statues.
Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco isn't exactly anyone's idea of a lovable leader. He ruled Spain with an iron fist for nearly 40 years, banned political opposition, censored the press, and made sure no one forgot who was in charge. Not exactly the guy you'd want running your HOA. But here's where it gets interesting. While Franco's politics were harsh, he also turned Spain from a pretty isolated, struggling country into a place that could actually function in the modern world. And he did it with concrete. Lots of concrete. Spain in the 1930s was behind much of Western Europe. Its infrastructure was outdated, its economy was limping, and parts of the country were barely connected to each other. Franco, ever the control freak, realized that if he wanted to keep Spain stable under his rule, he needed to quite literally connect the country. So he launched massive public works projects, roads, railways, and a ton of dams. Let's start with the roads. Franco's government built thousands of miles of new highways, which sounds kind of boring until you realize how game-changing that was. Villages that had been isolated for centuries suddenly had a way to trade, travel, and communicate. The road network tied Spain together in a way that hadn't been possible before, which made it easier to move goods, easier to move people, and yes, easier for Franco to move soldiers if anyone got rebellious. Then there was the dams. Franco's regime built hundreds of them, turning Spain into one of the most hydro-powered countries in Europe. These dams provided electricity, water for farming, and even helped control flooding. Rural communities that had been stuck with unreliable water supplies suddenly had consistent irrigation, which boosted food production. In a way, Franco's projects dragged Spain into the 20th century, whether people liked it or not. Of course, this was all wrapped up in Franco's propaganda machine. He portrayed himself as the savior of Spain, the man who was single-handedly modernizing the nation. The roads and dams weren't just infrastructure, they were monuments to his rule. But here's the thing, they worked. The economy grew, living standards improved, and by the time Franco died in 1975, Spain was far more connected and developed than when he started. None of this erases the darker parts of his regime, the repression, the executions, the total lack of democracy. But it does show that even a dictator can leave behind something that benefits future generations. Many of those dams are still in use today, still powering homes and watering fields. So, yeah, Franco may have ruled with fear and censorship, but he also left Spain with roads that actually went somewhere, and dams that actually worked. It's a strange legacy, part tyranny, part nation builder, but it's hard to ignore how much those projects shaped modern Spain.
Al Capone. Al Capone is the last guy you'd expect to be serving soup to the hungry. This was Chicago's most infamous gangster, a man whose empire was built on bootlegging, gambling, and enough violent crime to keep the newspapers busy for years. But in the early 1930s, Capone shocked everyone by opening one of the city's very first soup kitchens and feeding thousands of desperate people every day. The Great Depression had just hit, and Chicago was hurting. Unemployment skyrocketed, families were starving, and people were literally lining up for bread. The government was slow to respond, charities were overwhelmed, and into that vacuum stepped public enemy number one. Capone opened a free soup kitchen on South State Street that served breakfast, lunch, and dinner to anyone who showed up, no questions asked. And this wasn't some token gesture. Reports say his kitchen served over 2,000 meals a day. Hungry men, women, and children could come in, sit down, and get a hot bowl of soup, bread, and coffee, all on Capone's dime. For many, it was the only food they had that day. Now, let's be real. Capone wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He had an image problem. The newspapers had been calling him a murderer and a menace for years, and the authorities were breathing down his neck. Opening a soup kitchen was a PR masterstroke. Suddenly, there were stories about Scarface feeding the poor when the government wasn't. It made him look like a man of the people, a Robin Hood figure instead of just a gangster. But here's the thing. The people eating that soup didn't care why he was doing it. They just knew their stomachs were full. And for a moment, the man who had terrorized Chicago was its unlikely benefactor. There's even a story that one day a man walked into the kitchen and said, "Capone ain't such a bad fella after all." That's the power of feeding people. It changes the way they see you, at least temporarily. The irony is almost too good. A man who made millions by breaking the law ended up doing more for Chicago's hungry than the city itself at the time. Historians still debate whether this act was purely cynical or if Capone really did feel some responsibility to give back. Maybe it was a bit of both. Either way, it worked. For a short time, Al Capone wasn't just the king of organized crime. He was also the guy who kept thousands of Chicagoans from going hungry. It's a weird reminder that even the baddest people in history sometimes have moments where they do something genuinely good. In Capone's case, it just happened to come with bread and a steaming bowl of soup.
Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar might be the most infamous drug lord in history. The man practically turned cocaine into Colombia's biggest export. His cartel flooded the world with drugs, made billions of dollars, and caused enough chaos to make an entire government go to war with him. But here's the twist. In his hometown of Medellin, Escobar wasn't just feared, he was loved. Why? Because he used some of that drug money to build houses and soccer fields for the poor. Medellin in the 1980s was struggling. Poverty was everywhere, crime was rampant, and a lot of people were living in shacks with no running water, no electricity, no real future. Escobar saw an opportunity and built hundreds of homes for families who had nothing. He moved people out of dangerous hillside slums into real neighborhoods with proper roofs and working bathrooms. To those families, he wasn't just a drug kingpin. He was a savior. But Escobar didn't stop at housing. He loved soccer, so he built dozens of soccer fields across Medellin. Kids who had nothing to do but get into trouble suddenly had a place to play. He even sponsored youth teams and handed out uniforms. Imagine being a kid in one of the poorest neighborhoods and getting to play on a real field with real gear, thanks to a man who ran one of the most powerful criminal organizations on earth. And yeah, it wasn't all charity. Escobar was basically buying loyalty. The people in those neighborhoods became his supporters, his unofficial shield against the government. When police came looking for him, locals warned him. When the government tried to paint him as a monster, these communities saw him as the guy who gave them a roof over their heads. Still, you can't ignore the impact he had on the city. For a generation of poor Colombians, Escobar's money meant food on the table, a safe place to sleep, and a bit of dignity. Even today, some of those housing projects are still standing, and some of those soccer fields are still being used. It's a complicated legacy, part philanthropy, part manipulation, and that's what makes it fascinating. Pablo Escobar caused untold suffering, violence, addiction, corruption. But he also created opportunities for people who had been ignored by everyone else. He turned himself into a kind of folk hero, the outlaw who took care of his people when no one else would.
So yes, Escobar was ruthless and dangerous, but for the poorest neighborhoods of Medellin, he was also the guy who gave them a chance at a better life. It's the ultimate contradiction. One of history's deadliest criminals also gave kids a place to play soccer after school. Makes you wonder how many people would have supported him if he'd never built those homes or if the government had stepped in to do it first.
Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano was one of the most notorious mob bosses in American history. The guy who basically helped invent the modern mafia. He ran gambling, racketeering, and had enough connections to make politicians nervous. But in one of history's strangest twists, this same man ended up secretly helping the U.S. Navy during World War II. Here's the setup. It's 1942, and the United States is terrified that German saboteurs are going to attack New York Harbor. The docks were a vital part of the war effort, shipping weapons, food, and troops overseas. Then one day, the SS Normandy, a French luxury liner being converted into a troop ship, mysteriously caught fire and capsized in the harbor. Whether it was sabotage or just an accident, it freaked everyone out. The Navy realized they had a problem. They didn't actually control the docks. The mob did. Dock workers, unions, stevedores, they all answered directly or indirectly to the mafia. And no one knew the docks better than the mob bosses who ran them. So the Navy did something that sounds like the plot of a crime movie. They made a deal with Luciano. At the time, Luciano was sitting in prison for running a prostitution ring. But the Navy approached him through intermediaries and basically said, "Help us keep the docks safe and we'll make it worth your while." Luciano agreed. He used his influence to make sure there were no strikes, no slowdowns, and no sabotage. Mafia-controlled dock workers suddenly became very patriotic and very cooperative. Any rumors of enemy activity got passed along quickly. Luciano's network became an unofficial security force, and it worked. The docks stayed secure for the rest of the war, and there were no more disasters like the Normandy. When the war ended, Luciano got his reward. His prison sentence was commuted, and he was deported to Italy. Sure, he couldn't come back to the U.S., but he was a free man. And he just went from public enemy to wartime asset. It's one of those moments in history where morality gets blurry. Was Luciano still a criminal? Absolutely. But did his actions protect American ships, supplies, and maybe even lives? Also, yes. He did something the government couldn't do on its own, keep the underworld in line long enough to get through the war. So yeah, Lucky Luciano may have been a mob boss, but during World War II, he was also, in a weird way, a war hero. Not the kind you put on a recruitment poster, but the kind who gets the job done in the shadows. It's one of those rare times when organized crime is literally organized to keep the country safe.
Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was known as the mob's accountant, a criminal mastermind who helped build organized crime into a business empire. He ran gambling operations, laundered money, and made sure the mafia stayed rich and efficient. But here's the part of his story most people don't talk about.
During World War II, Lansky quietly funneled a fortune into helping Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution. Lansky was born into a Jewish family in Eastern Europe, so he didn't need anyone to explain what Hitler was doing. He saw the newsreels, he heard the reports of mass killings, and he understood exactly what was happening to Jews in Europe. While governments argued about how to respond, Lansky decided to use what he had, money and connections, to make a difference. He started donating huge sums of cash to groups that were helping Jewish refugees escape to safer countries, including what was then British-controlled Palestine. These weren't just token donations. We're talking about money that funded ships, bribed officials, and kept entire families alive while they waited for visas. And it didn't stop there. Lansky also supported the creation of armed self-defense groups to protect Jewish communities from attacks. Some accounts even say he used his mob network to smuggle weapons to these groups, which later became part of Israel's fight for independence. That's right, the same man who rigged casino games and fixed horse races may have helped lay the groundwork for the future Israeli military. This wasn't a PR stunt. Lansky wasn't trying to clean up his image. He actually kept most of it quiet. He didn't want headlines. He wanted results. For someone who spent his career being labeled a gangster, this was one of the few times he acted purely out of personal conviction. Of course, none of this erases the fact that Lansky was still running an international crime syndicate. He made millions from illegal gambling, bribery, and racketeering. But it does make his story a little more complicated. You can picture him counting mob money one minute and wiring a chunk of it overseas to save lives the next. It's one of those moments where you realize that morality isn't always black and white. Here's a guy who spent his life breaking laws, and yet, when it came to fighting real evil, he stepped up and did something genuinely good. So yes, Meyer Lansky was a gangster, but he was also someone who used his power and money to help people when they needed it most. That's not exactly the story Hollywood tells when they make mob movies, but maybe it should be, because it shows that even in the darkest corners of the underworld, sometimes there's still a bit of light.
Dutch Schultz. Dutch Schultz was one of New York's most feared gangsters during the Prohibition era. He made a fortune running bootleg liquor, controlled numbers rackets, and wasn't exactly shy about using violence to solve problems. If you crossed him, you usually didn't live long enough to regret it. But here's the part that throws people off. Schultz also poured money into orphanages and charities, like some kind of twisted philanthropist with a Tommy gun. By the early 1930s, Schultz had become a household name, and not in a good way. Newspapers loved writing about him, the cops loved trying to catch him, and ordinary people thought of him as just another dangerous mobster. Schultz, being the PR-conscious criminal that he was, decided he needed a little rebranding. So he started giving money away. He donated to orphanages, soup kitchens, and community causes. He made sure the press knew about it too. Stories of Dutch Schultz as the generous benefactor started popping up alongside stories of Dutch Schultz as the public enemy.
And this wasn't just a one-time thing. Schultz funded events for kids, handed out cash to struggling families, and tried to paint himself as a man of the people. Some accounts say he even walked through neighborhoods handing out bills to random passerbys, which, let's be honest, probably made him very popular very quickly. Of course, this wasn't pure altruism. Schultz was smart enough to know that public opinion mattered. If the people saw him as a Robin Hood figure instead of a menace, they might be less likely to help the police take him down. Plus, juries are made of ordinary citizens, and if they like you, they're more likely to acquit. And in a weird way, it worked. For a while, Schultz had this strange dual reputation. Ruthless gangster to his enemies, generous benefactor to the poor. It's the same trick a lot of mobsters pulled. Give back just enough to the community so that people start saying, he's not all bad. But the irony is hard to ignore. The money Schultz was handing out to orphanages, it came from the very rackets that were hurting communities. Illegal liquor, gambling, and extortion. He was basically giving people back a fraction of what he'd taken from them. Still, for those kids in the orphanage, that money was real, and it probably made their lives a little better. Schultz's story ends violently. He was gunned down in 1935 in a gangland hit, but his brief career as a philanthropist is one of those strange reminders that even the most dangerous criminals sometimes try to buy a little redemption. Whether he meant it or not, those donations fed people, clothed kids, and kept the lights on in places that desperately needed help. So yeah, Dutch Schultz might have been a killer, but for a little while, he was also Santa Claus with a fedora.
When you think of pirates, you probably picture them plundering gold, waving cutlasses and yelling, "Arr!" But Blackbeard, yes, the most feared pirate of them all, once blockaded an entire city, not for treasure, but for medicine. Seriously. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, was the guy other pirates wanted to be. He had a legendary black beard, obviously, lit slow-burning fuses under his hat so smoke would curl around his face, and commanded a fleet that terrorized the Caribbean. But in 1718, he did something that doesn't quite fit the scary pirate image. His crew had come down with a nasty case of syphilis, and this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. Untreated, syphilis could cause blindness, insanity, and eventually death. Blackbeard needed medicine, and he needed it fast, so he sailed to Charleston, South Carolina, one of the richest ports in the American colonies, and parked his ships right at the harbor entrance. For nearly a week, Blackbeard and his men stopped every single ship going in or out. They didn't steal gold. They didn't sink anything. They just held the entire city hostage until Charleston sent them what they wanted, a chest full of medical supplies. This wasn't just petty theft. It was calculated negotiation. Blackbeard even sent some of his men into the city to meet with officials and make the deal. Once the medicine was delivered, he let all the captured ships go, cargo intact, and sailed off. It's one of the few times in pirate history where the ransom wasn't money, but antibiotics' 18th century equivalent. Of course, this didn't make him a saint. Blackbeard was still a pirate who robbed, plundered, and fought bloody battles. But this particular stunt shows a different side to him. The captain who prioritized his crew's health over loot. He could have taken a fortune in goods,
But instead, he just wanted to keep his men alive. And you have to admit, there's something strangely admirable about that. Blackbeard risked his fleet and reputation to save his crew. That's loyalty. It also shows how organized piracy could be. This wasn't chaotic raiding. This was a full-on diplomatic standoff, pirate style. Today, this episode is remembered as one of the most unusual pirate blockades in history. It paints a picture of Blackbeard not just as a bloodthirsty villain, but as a leader who took care of his own, even if it meant holding an entire colony's economy hostage for a box of medicine. So yeah, Blackbeard may have been a nightmare for the British Navy, but he was also the guy who proved that sometimes pirates weren't just after gold. Sometimes they were after penicillin's great-great-grandfather. And honestly, that might be the most human thing he ever did.
Pirate Benjamin Hornigold was a guy who proved that even pirates can get sentimental about their homeland. He was one of the most notorious pirates in the early 1700s, sailing around the Caribbean and plundering just about anything that floated. But in one of the strangest turns in pirate history, Hornigold decided to stop attacking British ships altogether because he got patriotic. Hornigold started out like most pirates of his day, a former privateer. That meant he used to have government permission to attack enemy ships during wartime. When the war ended, so did the legal license to raid, but Hornigold and a lot of other sailors didn't want to give up the pirate life. So he just kept going, targeting merchant ships, Spanish galleons, and anything else worth looting. But here's where it gets interesting. Somewhere along the line, Hornigold had a change of heart. He announced that he would no longer attack ships flying the British flag. Spanish, French, Dutch, fair game. But if you were British, you were safe, at least from him. This wasn't exactly great news for the rest of his crew, who were in it purely for the money and didn't care what flag was on the mast. But Hornigold stuck to his rule. In one famous incident, his crew captured a ship, and when they found out it was British, Hornigold ordered them to give it back, along with whatever loot they had already taken. Imagine being one of those pirates, watching your captain hand back the treasure you just risked your neck to steal. Not surprisingly, some of his crew eventually mutinied and left him. Historians still debate exactly why Hornigold made this decision. Some say it was out of loyalty to the crown. He was, after all, an Englishman. Others think it was a smart move to prepare for a pardon, which he eventually did receive. Hornigold accepted the king's pardon in 1718, gave up piracy entirely, and even became a pirate hunter for the British government, tracking down the very kind of men he used to sail with. It's one of those rare cases where a pirate actually went legit, not because he was caught, but because he chose to. Whether it was patriotism, pragmatism, or just a clever way to retire without getting hanged, Hornigold's refusal to attack British ships was a turning point in his life. So yes, Benjamin Hornigold was a pirate, but he was also a man who decided that loyalty to his flag was more important than a quick payday. It's a strange little footnote in pirate history. The outlaw who started putting national pride above plunder. Turns out, sometimes even pirates have a code. And in Hornigold's case, that code had a Union Jack on it.
John Dillinger. John Dillinger might just be the closest thing America ever had to a real-life Robin Hood, except his bow and arrow were a Thompson submachine gun. During the Great Depression, Dillinger became the country's most famous bank robber, a man who could hit a bank in broad daylight, smile for the cameras, and vanish before the cops could even get their cars started. But one detail about his heists has turned him into a bit of a folk hero. He supposedly returned money that belonged to ordinary farmers. The 1930s were brutal for small farmers. The banks were foreclosing on their land left and right, and people were losing everything they had worked for. Banks were seen as villains, faceless institutions squeezing regular folks during the worst economic crisis in American history. Dillinger knew this, and he used it to his advantage. Stories began circulating that when Dillinger robbed a bank, he would check who the money belonged to. If it was farmers' deposits, he'd hand it back. One famous story goes that during a robbery, a farmer nervously handed Dillinger his wallet. Dillinger supposedly smiled, gave it back, and said, "Keep it, we only want the bank's money." Whether every story was true or not, these tales spread like wildfire. They turned Dillinger from just a criminal into a symbol, the guy who stood up to the banks when no one else could. People lined up to see him when he was briefly arrested and paraded before the press. Some even cheered him on, secretly hoping he'd get away. And it wasn't just about money. Dillinger had style. He was polite to hostages, tipped his hat, and tried not to hurt anyone during his heists. He escaped from jail more than once, including one time with a fake gun carved out of wood, which only added to his legend. Of course, this doesn't mean Dillinger was a saint. He carried guns, got into shootouts, and some people did get killed during his crime spree. But the fact that he deliberately avoided taking money from poor depositors made him stand out from the average thug. In an era where desperation and distrust of the system were sky high, Dillinger became the outlaw people wanted to root for. Eventually, the FBI caught up with him, or rather, trapped him outside a movie theater in Chicago in 1934. Dillinger's death was national news, but his legend lived on. So yes, John Dillinger was a bank robber, but he was also a kind of Depression-era anti-hero. The image of him handing back a farmer's hard-earned savings while emptying the bank's vault made him more than just a criminal. It made him a symbol.
Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun might be one of the most complicated figures in science history. He was the man who dreamed of taking humanity to the stars, and the same man who built rockets for Hitler during World War II. Yeah, that's a resume that will raise some eyebrows. Von Braun was a brilliant rocket engineer, a genius at turning science fiction-style dreams into real hardware. Unfortunately, his first big employer was Nazi Germany. He developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided missile. It was a terrifying weapon used to bomb London and other cities, killing thousands. Even worse, the V-2 program used forced labor from concentration camps, and von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party and the SS. After the war, the Allies realized something. They could either put von Braun on trial
or they could use his brain. And in the early days of the Cold War, brains like his were worth a lot. The U.S. launched Operation Paperclip, secretly bringing von Braun and his team to America. Instead of sitting in a cell, he ended up in Alabama. Yes, really, working for the U.S. Army to develop missiles. But here's where the story shifts. Von Braun never stopped dreaming about space travel. He wanted to build rockets that didn't just deliver warheads, but carried humans beyond Earth. Eventually, NASA gave him the chance. He became the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, the monster rocket that sent Apollo astronauts to the moon. That means the guy who once built weapons for Hitler ended up putting Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. It's a wild redemption arc if there ever was one. Without von Braun's work, the space race might have ended very differently, and humanity's first steps on the moon might have taken decades longer. Of course, von Braun's past never went away. Some critics said he was just a pragmatist who switched sides when it was convenient. Others argue he was always more of a scientist than a Nazi, that he joined the party to keep funding his research, not because he believed in the ideology. The truth is, probably somewhere in between. But what's undeniable is the impact he had. Von Braun's work didn't just win the space race, it inspired generations to look up at the night sky and think, we can go there. That's a pretty incredible legacy for someone with such a dark past. So yes, Werner von Braun's story is messy, part war criminal, part visionary. But without him, the phrase, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, might never have been spoken at all. He's proof that history's heroes and villains aren't always easy to separate. Sometimes they're the same person, just working on a different kind of rocket.
Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber might be one of the most paradoxical figures in all of science. On one hand, he's called the father of chemical warfare. On the other, he's credited with saving more lives than almost any other human in history. Talk about a complicated legacy. Haber was a German chemist in the early 1900s who figured out something that changed the world: how to pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into ammonia. Sounds simple, but this discovery made synthetic fertilizer possible. Before this, farmers were running out of natural sources of nitrogen like guano and manure, and people were predicting mass starvation. Haber's process, now called the Haber-Bosch process, meant we could produce fertilizer on an industrial scale. Today, roughly half of the nitrogen in your body originally came from this process. In other words, if you've eaten bread, rice, or anything grown in a field, you have Haber to thank for existing. Billions, literally billions of lives have been saved from famine because of this invention. But here's the darker side. During World War I, Haber didn't just work in a lab making food safer. He led Germany's chemical warfare program and personally oversaw the first large-scale chlorine gas attack at Ypres in 1915. That attack killed thousands and opened a door to a horrifying new kind of warfare. Haber saw this as patriotism. He believed science should serve his country, even if it meant creating weapons of mass destruction. The moral conflict in his life was intense. His wife, also a chemist, was reportedly so horrified by his involvement in chemical warfare that she took her own life. And yet, Haber kept working, convinced he was doing the right thing.
After the war, he even won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the fertilizer process, not the gas attacks, which caused outrage in some circles. It's one of the strangest legacies in science. One man responsible for both saving and taking millions of lives. Some historians argue that Haber's invention of synthetic fertilizer might have saved more people than all the wars of the 20th century killed. Others say the environmental impact of mass fertilizer use, things like runoff and climate change, make his legacy even more complicated. But here's the bottom line. Without Haber, the planet could not sustain 8 billion humans. He made it possible to feed the modern world. And at the same time, he gave us a terrifying glimpse of how science can be used to kill on an industrial scale. Fritz Haber is a reminder that history's good guys and bad guys aren't always clear-cut. One man can be both, a hero when he's feeding the world, and a villain when he's gassing enemy soldiers. And somehow we still live with both sides of his legacy every single day. Alfred Nobel. Alfred Nobel is one of those names that instantly makes you think of peace, science, and achievement. You know, Nobel Prizes, medals, big speeches. But here's the twist. The man behind the world's most famous peace prize is the same guy who invented dynamite. Yep, the global symbol of peace was basically brought to you by a man who made blowing things up easier. Nobel was a Swedish chemist and inventor who spent much of his life tinkering with explosives. In the 1800s, nitroglycerin was already known, but it was dangerously unstable. It could explode just by being bumped. Nobel figured out how to stabilize it by mixing it with an absorbent material, creating what we now know as dynamite. Suddenly, explosives became much safer to handle and transport. At first, this was great news for industries like mining and construction. Dynamite made it possible to dig tunnels, build railroads, and blast through mountains more safely and cheaply. Nobel became incredibly rich from his invention. We're talking about a 19th century version of a tech billionaire. But of course, humans being humans, dynamite didn't stay in the mines for long. Armies started using it in war, and Nobel got a reputation as, well, the guy who made war deadlier. Then, something happened that changed everything. A French newspaper accidentally published his obituary while he was still alive. The headline? "The Merchant of Death is dead." Imagine reading your own obituary and seeing yourself described that way. Nobel was horrified. He didn't want to be remembered as the man who got rich off destruction. So he decided to do something about it. When he died for real in 1896, his will revealed a shocker. He left almost his entire fortune, the modern equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars, to create a set of prizes that would reward people for advancing science, literature, and, most famously, peace. That decision gave birth to the Nobel Prizes we know today. Every year, scientists, writers, and peacemakers are honored with what has become the most prestigious award on the planet, all because one man wanted to rewrite his own legacy. It's kind of poetic, isn't it? The guy who made it easier to destroy things ended up creating an institution dedicated to recognizing those who build, discover, and heal. So yes, Alfred Nobel was the inventor of dynamite, but he was also the man who turned his guilt into something that has inspired generations to do better. Every Nobel Peace Prize handed out is a reminder that people can change how they're remembered. Nobel literally blew up the world, then used his fortune to make it a little better.
Thomas Midgley Jr. Thomas Midgley Jr. is one of those people who changed the world so dramatically that historians can't decide whether to thank him or curse his name. He's often called the man who had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism. And they're not exaggerating. He quite literally changed the air we breathe. Midgley was a brilliant American chemist in the early 1900s, and his first big breakthrough was solving a nasty problem with car engines, something called engine knock. This was when fuel combusted unevenly and made engines run rough. Midgley discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline made engines run smoothly. Problem solved. Cars ran better, quieter, and more efficiently. But here's the catch. Lead is, well, poison. And not just a little poison, it's a neurotoxin that builds up in the body and causes brain damage, especially in children. At the time, the health effects weren't fully understood or were conveniently ignored, but eventually, leaded gasoline would be linked to decades of public health problems. Some researchers even argue that widespread lead exposure may have contributed to higher crime rates in the 20th century. So yeah, that invention didn't exactly age well. But Midgley wasn't done. His next problem to solve was refrigeration. Back then, refrigerators and air conditioners used toxic gases like ammonia or sulfur dioxide as coolants. If a fridge leaked, it could literally kill you. Midgley and his team developed a new, safer coolant, chlorofluorocarbon, better known as Freon. This was a huge deal. Suddenly, refrigeration became safe and practical for homes and businesses. Food could be stored longer without risk, medicine could be kept cold, and air conditioning became widespread, changing how people lived in hot climates. Millions of lives were improved because of this single invention. Of course, we later found out that CFCs, like Freon, destroy the ozone layer, the protective shield that keeps Earth from getting fried by ultraviolet radiation. By the 1980s, scientists realized we were punching a giant hole in the sky, and Freon was banned worldwide. So Thomas Midgley Jr. managed to invent two of the most useful technologies of the 20th century, and both of them ended up causing massive global problems. It's almost darkly comedic how unlucky his legacy is. One science writer even joked that Midgley had an instinct for the regrettable. But it's worth remembering that when he made these discoveries, he was solving real problems and making life better for millions. He wasn't setting out to poison the planet. He was just trying to make cars run smoother and fridges safer. So Thomas Midgley Jr. is both a cautionary tale and a reminder of how powerful human ingenuity can be. He made modern life possible and then made it a little toxic, literally.
Kary Mullis. Kary Mullis might be one of the strangest geniuses you've never heard of, and also one of the most important. He was a biochemist who, in the 1980s, invented something called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. And if that sounds boring, trust me, it's not.
PCR is the reason we can do DNA tests, solve crimes with a single hair, and even sequence entire genomes. Basically, it turned genetics into a power tool. Here's how it works in plain English. PCR is like a photocopier for DNA. It can take the tiniest bit of genetic material and make millions of copies of it in just a few hours. Before PCR, scientists were working with ridiculously tiny samples that took forever to analyze. Mullis's invention supercharged biology and medicine. Forensics, paternity tests, ancestry kits, all of it traces back to PCR. Even COVID tests? Yep, those relied on Mullis's invention too. But Mullis wasn't just a scientist. He was also a character. He had a wild streak and loved to surf, drive fast cars, and party. He once claimed he came up with the idea for PCR while driving along a California highway at night, possibly under the influence of LSD. Whether that's true or just a good story, it fits his vibe. He was also known for his, let's say, controversial opinions. Mullis publicly questioned mainstream climate science, doubted the link between HIV and AIDS, and wasn't shy about criticizing other scientists. Some people saw him as a brilliant maverick. Others saw him as a troublemaker who didn't play well with the scientific establishment. But here's the thing. Regardless of his views, his invention changed medicine forever. PCR made it possible to detect diseases earlier, catch criminals with tiny bits of evidence, and even bring back extinct species DNA for study. It opened up whole new fields of research. Mullis won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1993, and deservedly so. His work arguably saved millions of lives and made modern genetic science possible. Of course, Mullis himself seemed to enjoy poking at the very system that honored him. He wasn't a polished, suit-and-tie scientist giving stiff lectures. He was the guy who would show up barefoot to a talk and tell stories about surfing. So yes, Kary Mullis was controversial, a bit eccentric, and definitely not afraid to speak his mind. But he also gave the world one of the most important tools in the history of biology. Thanks to him, we can catch killers, track pandemics, and understand life on a molecular level. Not bad for an idea born on a late-night drive.
Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons might be the wildest character in the history of science, and that's saying something. He was a brilliant rocket engineer, a visionary who helped launch the space age, and an occultist who performed mystical rituals in his backyard. Yep, this guy helped invent modern rocketry by day and summoned spirits by night. Parsons grew up obsessed with space and explosives, which is either a recipe for disaster or genius, depending on how you look at it. In the 1930s, he started experimenting with rockets when most scientists thought rockets were a joke. He co-founded what would later become NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, the birthplace of America's space program. Without Parsons, we might not have the rockets that took us to the moon.
His contributions were huge. He pioneered new types of rocket fuel, figured out how to make engines powerful and reliable enough to actually work, and turned rocketry from a hobby for science nerds into a serious field. People literally called him the father of solid rocket fuel. His work laid the foundation for missiles, satellites, and space exploration as we know it. But Parsons wasn't just a scientist, he was also deep into the occult. He became a follower of Aleister Crowley, the famous or infamous occultist, and joined a secret society that practiced magic. Yes, with a K. He hosted rituals at his house in Pasadena, which became a hub for both rocket scientists and bohemian freethinkers. Imagine a place where brilliant engineers, artists, and mystics all hang out, talk about space travel, and occasionally try to summon a goddess. That was Jack Parsons' life. This double life made him a fascinating and controversial figure. The FBI actually kept an eye on him, worried that his connections to strange spiritual groups and wild parties made him a security risk during World War II. Some of his colleagues thought he was brilliant, others thought he was downright dangerous. His life ended as dramatically as he lived it. In 1952, Parsons was killed in a mysterious explosion in his home laboratory, still one of the great unsolved stories in science history. Accident, assassination, or something even weirder? No one really knows. What we do know is that his work changed the world. Today, JPL is one of the most important space research centers on Earth, and every time a spacecraft launches toward Mars, it's carrying a little bit of Jack Parsons' legacy with it. So yeah, Jack Parsons might have been summoning spirits under the moonlight, but he also gave humanity the tools to actually leave the Earth. He's proof that genius doesn't always look like a guy in a white lab coat. Sometimes it looks like a rocket scientist with a taste for the occult and a flair for the dramatic.
Unit 731 Scientists. This one is about as disturbing as history gets. Unit 731 was Imperial Japan's secret biological warfare program in World War II, and what they did was pure horror. We're talking human experimentation, frostbite tests, disease injections, vivisections done without anesthesia. Thousands of people, mostly Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, were tortured and killed in the name of research. But here's the twisted part. After the war, instead of putting every single scientist on trial, the U.S. struck a deal. The data Unit 731 collected, horrific though it was incredibly valuable. No one else had information that detailed about things like frostbite treatment, plague outbreaks, and how certain diseases spread. So the U.S. agreed not to prosecute many of the scientists in exchange for their research. It's a grim example of the ends justify the means mentality. That data ended up influencing how doctors treated frostbite injuries, improved knowledge about infectious diseases, and even helped in developing protections against biological warfare. In other words, medical science advanced, but the cost was unthinkable suffering. Some of the experiments sound like something out of a nightmare. Unit 731 exposed prisoners to extreme cold,
then tested different ways to thaw their limbs to see what worked best. They deliberately infected people with anthrax, plague, and cholera to study how fast the diseases spread and what might stop them. The scientists took meticulous notes, which is part of why the data was considered so valuable later. This is where things get morally messy. The information probably saved lives in the long run. Soldiers fighting in freezing conditions learned how to avoid losing limbs, and public health systems got better at preventing epidemics. But it also meant the perpetrators escaped justice. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which executed Nazi doctors for similar crimes, many of the Unit 731 scientists went on to have comfortable careers in post-war Japan. To this day, this is still a controversial subject. Some argue that using the data was immoral because it legitimized the atrocities. Others argue that ignoring it would have been throwing away knowledge that could save lives. Either way, it's one of history's darkest examples of how something evil can end up producing something useful. Unit 731 reminds us that scientific progress sometimes comes with a horrifying price tag and that we still wrestle with where to draw the line. The medical breakthroughs we take for granted today might trace back to a freezing laboratory in Manchuria where prisoners were suffering. It's a deeply uncomfortable truth, but it's also a part of why we have strict ethics rules for research now. So yes, the work of Unit 731 scientists contributed to medicine, but it's one of those facts that's hard to say out loud without feeling uneasy. Science got smarter, but humanity got a reminder of just how far into darkness people can go in the name of discovery.
H. Holmes might be America's first true serial killer, and he was as chilling as they come. During the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, Holmes lured dozens, maybe hundreds of victims to what newspapers later called his murder castle. A building full of secret rooms, trapdoors, and gas chambers designed to make people disappear. It sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but it was real. Holmes was a con man, a swindler, and a murderer who turned killing into a twisted business model. But here's the strange part. His case actually helped push forensic science and criminal investigation techniques forward in ways that still affect how detectives work today. Back in the 1890s, police work wasn't very scientific. Fingerprinting was barely a thing. Crime scenes were often contaminated, and many murders went unsolved simply because investigators had no tools to link killers to their crimes. Holmes's case changed that. When investigators finally caught on to him, they had to piece together a complex puzzle. Holmes had scattered victims across multiple states and used elaborate schemes to cover his tracks. Detectives had to dig up remains, analyze bones, and compare dental records, techniques that were cutting edge for the time. This case showed just how powerful forensic science could be when used carefully. Holmes's trial also became one of the most sensational in American history. The newspapers couldn't get enough of him, and the public was both horrified and fascinated. That media frenzy actually led to more attention on improving policing standards. Suddenly, people realized that catching killers wasn't just about intuition. It was about evidence, analysis,
and building a case that could stand up in court. Holmes's crimes even helped encourage the creation of centralized criminal databases. The need to track a criminal operating across multiple jurisdictions became obvious. Law enforcement agencies started sharing information more effectively, which laid the groundwork for the kind of nationwide systems we take for granted today. Of course, none of this was Holmes's intention. He wasn't sitting in his castle thinking, "I'm going to revolutionize forensic science." He was just doing his evil thing. But in a strange way, the sheer scale and horror of his crimes forced society to get better at catching people like him. Holmes was eventually caught, convicted, and hanged in 1896. But his legacy is still felt, not just in true crime books, but in the way investigators work. Every time detectives analyze bone fragments, use dental records, or build a criminal profile, they're drawing on lessons learned from cases like Holmes. So yes, H. Holmes was a monster, but he also, unintentionally, made law enforcement smarter. He helped push murder investigations out of the Wild West era and into the scientific age. It's one of those rare cases where something truly awful left behind something that actually made the world a little safer.
Vlad the Impaler. Vlad the Impaler has one of the scariest reputations in history. His nickname wasn't a joke. This was the 15th century ruler who made a habit of literally impaling his enemies on giant wooden stakes and leaving their bodies on display as a warning. If you think that sounds like something out of a horror movie, you're right. He's the guy who inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula. But here's the twist. Vlad wasn't just a terrifying warlord. He was also kind of obsessed with justice, at least his version of it, and he put some of the earliest anti-corruption laws in place in his country, Wallachia. During Vlad's time, corruption was rampant. Local nobles, called boyars, abused their power, taxed peasants unfairly, and plotted against anyone who tried to rule. Vlad, being Vlad, wasn't having it. He passed strict laws to punish thieves, bribery, and dishonest merchants. If you cheated someone, you could expect some very creative punishments, sometimes death. The thing is, it actually worked. Crime dropped dramatically during his rule. Merchants reportedly felt safe enough to leave gold in the market square overnight without fear of it being stolen. There's even a story, probably exaggerated, but too good to ignore, that Vlad put a golden cup at a public fountain for anyone to use. Nobody dared steal it because they knew exactly what would happen if they got caught. Vlad's brand of justice was brutal, but it kept order. For the common people, this was a big deal. Instead of living under a corrupt system where the rich could do whatever they wanted, peasants suddenly had a ruler who, in his own terrifying way, kept the playing field a little more level. Of course, this was partly selfish. Vlad needed a loyal population to hold off the Ottoman Empire and keep his throne. Crushing corruption wasn't just about fairness, it was about survival. By eliminating the boyars who plotted against him and keeping crime under control, he secured his own power. But the legacy stuck. Vlad became known not just as a cruel ruler, but as someone who brought stability to Wallachia. Even today, some Romanians see him as a national hero who
who fought for justice and independence. The Dracula myth overshadows it, but Vlad's efforts to impose law and order were way ahead of their time. So yes, Vlad the Impaler was absolutely terrifying, but he also made sure that if you were an honest farmer or merchant, you could actually sleep at night without worrying that your neighbor would rob you blind. He turned Wallachia into a place where lawbreakers thought twice, mostly because they didn't want to end up on a very tall, very sharp stick.
Grigori Rasputin. Grigori Rasputin is one of those historical figures who seems larger than life. The so-called mad monk with the hypnotic stare, the unkempt beard, and the reputation for seducing half the Russian court. He's been blamed for bringing down the Romanov dynasty, accused of dark magic, and turned into a near mythical villain. But here's the strange part. Rasputin may have genuinely saved the life of the Tsar's only son, more than once. Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Russian throne, had hemophilia, a genetic condition that made even a small cut potentially fatal because his blood wouldn't clot properly. Back in the early 1900s, this was basically a death sentence. The Romanovs tried everything, the best doctors, the newest treatments, and nothing seemed to work. Then along came Rasputin, a peasant-turned-mystic with a reputation as a healer. When Alexei suffered a particularly bad bleeding episode, Rasputin was called in as a last resort. Accounts say he prayed over the boy, told the family to keep him calm, and somehow Alexei's condition improved. The bleeding slowed, his fever broke, and he recovered. Modern historians have a few theories about how Rasputin pulled this off. One is that he told the doctors to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which at the time was a new wonder drug, but also a blood thinner. Without aspirin in his system, Alexei's bleeding may have stopped naturally. Rasputin also had a calming effect on the family. Stress can make hemophilia worse, so just getting everyone to chill out might have helped the boy stabilize. Whatever the reason, the Romanovs became convinced that Rasputin had almost supernatural powers. This peasant mystic suddenly had the ear of the royal family, and his influence grew dramatically. The public, of course, hated it. Rumors flew that Rasputin was controlling the Tsarina, corrupting the court, and steering Russia off a cliff. And okay, Rasputin wasn't exactly an angel. He drank heavily, womanized openly, and had a knack for making powerful enemies. But it's hard to ignore the fact that, at least when it came to Alexei, he seemed to have a real gift. Without Rasputin's intervention, the boy might have died years earlier, which could have thrown Russia into even more political chaos than it already faced. Ironically, Rasputin's closeness to the royal family helped seal their fate. His presence fueled public anger and conspiracy theories that weakened support for the monarchy. But at least for a time, he kept the heir to the throne alive. So, yes, Rasputin may have been a scandal magnet and one of history's most controversial figures. But he also gave a sick little boy a few more years of life. For all the rumors about black magic, that might be the most miraculous thing he ever did.
Saddam Hussein. When you hear the name Saddam Hussein, you probably think of dictatorship, war, and one of the most televised downfalls in modern history. But here's something most people don't know.
Saddam also poured a surprising amount of energy into making Iraq greener, literally greener. Back in the 1970s and 1980s, Saddam launched massive reforestation and irrigation projects across Iraq. The country had been struggling with desertification, fertile land turning to desert, and water shortages that were hurting farmers. Saddam, who saw himself as a modernizing leader, wanted to change that. He funded large-scale tree-planting campaigns, creating green belts around cities to reduce dust storms and slow the spread of the desert. Thousands of acres were planted with trees, some of which are still standing today. In a country where summers can reach oven-like temperatures, those trees made a real difference for air quality and erosion control. But Saddam didn't stop with trees. He built an extensive network of irrigation canals to expand agriculture, including the massive Saddam River, later renamed the Third River, which helped divert water from the Tigris and Euphrates to dry farmland. These projects boosted food production, turned barren land into productive fields, and provided jobs for thousands of Iraqis. Of course, this wasn't just Saddam being nice. He liked the image of being the nation builder who could turn the desert into farmland. The reforestation and canal projects doubled as propaganda, proof that under his leadership, Iraq was modern and self-sufficient. Billboards went up, speeches were made, and Saddam got the credit for every new orchard or wheat field. And here's where it gets complicated. The same man who planted trees also trained the Mesopotamian marshes in the 1990s to punish political opponents hiding there, destroying one of the most important wetlands in the world. So his environmental record is a mix of progress and devastation, depending on which part of the story you look at. Still, you can't deny that his earlier projects had a positive impact. Iraq's agricultural output grew, and the country became less dependent on food imports for a while. Some of the infrastructure built during Saddam's rule is still in use today, feeding millions of people. It's one of those strange legacies where a man known for brutality also left behind something that genuinely helped the land and the people, at least for a time. So, yes, Saddam Hussein was a dictator who caused wars and chaos, but he was also the guy who made parts of Iraq bloom again. It's a reminder that history's villains can still leave behind green fields and shady groves, even if they also left behind a very dark shadow.
Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu Sese Seko was one of Africa's most notorious strongmen, ruling what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, for over 3 decades. He was known for corruption, kleptocracy, and building a personal fortune so big he could have bought half of Paris if he wanted to. But here's the twist. The same man who looted his country's treasury also helped protect some of its rarest wildlife. During his time in power, Mobutu established several massive nature reserves and national parks to protect endangered species. He set aside huge areas of land for wildlife conservation, places like Virunga National Park, home to the critically endangered mountain gorilla. In fact, during Mobutu's early years, Virunga was considered one of the best protected parks in Africa. This wasn't just a nice gesture for the animals. Mobutu understood that Congo's wildlife was a national treasure and a potential source of tourism money. Protecting the gorillas
elephants, and other species gave him international credibility and made him look like a forward-thinking leader on the global stage. He even invited famous primatologist Dian Fossey to work in the region, helping bring attention to gorilla conservation. And here's the thing, for a while, it worked. Poaching was reduced, wildlife populations stabilized, and Congo became a hotspot for scientists and adventurers. Mobutu even passed laws to crack down on illegal hunting and ivory trafficking. The irony of a man who was robbing his own country blind, using state funds to protect elephants, isn't lost on anyone. But the results were real. Of course, it wasn't a perfect system. Corruption still existed, and some of Mobutu's own officials were accused of poaching on the side. But the fact remains that under his rule, some of these parks had their best years in terms of conservation. It's a rare case where a dictator's desire for international prestige actually benefited the environment. Later, as Mobutu's regime began to collapse in the 1990s, many of these parks suffered. Rangers went unpaid, poaching skyrocketed, and some wildlife populations were devastated by conflict and neglect. But the infrastructure Mobutu put in place, the park boundaries, the ranger networks, the legal protections, are still being used today by conservationists trying to rebuild. So yes, Mobutu Sese Seko was a kleptocrat who enriched himself while his country struggled, but he also helped save some of the rarest animals on Earth from extinction. His parks are still some of the last safe havens for mountain gorillas and okapis. It's a strange legacy, part dictator, part accidental environmentalist. But it shows that even the most corrupt rulers can end up leaving something behind that's worth protecting, even if it's not what they're remembered for first.
Nicolai Ceaușescu. Nicolai Ceaușescu is mostly remembered as one of Eastern Europe's most oppressive dictators, the guy who turned Romania into a surveillance state, built a massive vanity palace while people starved, and ended up facing a firing squad on live TV. But here's a part of his rule that doesn't get talked about much. Ceaușescu actually did a lot to protect Romania's wilderness. Romania is home to some of Europe's last great old-growth forests. Think towering beech trees, ancient oaks, and wild Carpathian mountains full of bears and wolves. During his rule, Ceaușescu put strict protections in place to keep those forests from being cut down. Logging was heavily regulated, and large areas were declared off-limits to commercial exploitation. While much of Europe's forests were shrinking, Romania's stayed remarkably intact. And it wasn't just the trees. Ceaușescu also banned hunting of certain species, particularly large predators like brown bears. He wasn't doing this out of pure love for nature. He loved to hunt them himself. But he wanted to make sure there were always enough animals left for him and his VIP guests to shoot. It was like his own private game reserve on a national scale. Still, the unintended result was that Romania's wildlife thrived. Populations of bears, wolves, and lynx stayed healthy, while these animals were disappearing in other parts of Europe. Even today, Romania has the largest brown bear population in the EU, thanks in part to those decades of protection. Ceaușescu also established nature reserves and national parks, some of which are still around today and now managed more responsibly.
Ironically, many of the conservation efforts Romania is proud of today started under a dictator who was more interested in showing off his power than being a good environmentalist. Of course, there was a darker side. When Ceaușescu wanted to hunt, he had the state arrange massive, carefully staged hunts where animals were practically herded in front of him so he could rack up huge kill counts. He once bragged about personally shooting thousands of animals, which, to be fair, is not exactly the vibe of a gentle forest protector. But even with that contradiction, the forests stayed standing and the animals survived. After Ceaușescu's fall in 1989, Romania's wild spaces became a major draw for ecotourism. Hikers, photographers, and scientists still flock to the Carpathians to see what much of Europe lost long ago: wild, untouched forest. So yes, Ceaușescu was a tyrant whose policies hurt millions of people. But he also accidentally left Romania with one of the most intact natural landscapes on the continent. It's one of those weird historical twists. A man who ruled with fear ended up preserving something beautiful that outlived him.
The Khmer Rouge is remembered for one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. They emptied Cambodia's cities, forced millions into brutal labor camps, and killed nearly 2 million people through executions, starvation, and disease. But here's a strange, unintended side effect of their horrifying regime. By forcing people out of cities and shutting down modern industry, they accidentally gave nature a massive breather. When the Khmer Rouge took over Phnom Penh in 1975, they ordered everyone out. Cities were abandoned, factories stopped running, and entire regions were left to the jungle. It was one of the most extreme back-to-the-land experiments in history. And while it was catastrophic for humans, the environment suddenly started to heal. With no cars on the roads and no industry pumping out pollution, Cambodia's air and water quality improved. Forests that had been getting chopped down for agriculture and development started to regrow. Wildlife returned to areas it had been driven out of. It was like someone hit the pause button on human impact and let the ecosystem do its thing for a few years. Researchers who have studied the period say that Cambodia's biodiversity actually benefited during those years. Populations of animals like tigers, elephants, and birds rebounded. Even fish stocks in rivers and lakes improved because there was less overfishing. In some ways, Cambodia became wilder than it had been in decades, not because anyone was trying to protect it, but because the population was too busy trying to survive. Of course, this wasn't some kind of environmental utopia. People were starving, forced to work in fields, and suffering under one of history's most repressive regimes. The Khmer Rouge didn't care about the environment. They cared about building their nightmare vision of an agrarian society. The ecological recovery was a side effect, not a goal. But when you look back, it's one of those strange examples of how removing human pressure, even under terrible circumstances, can quickly allow nature to bounce back. Today, conservationists point to cases like this to show how resilient ecosystems can be if they're given a chance, though hopefully without, the whole genocide part.
After the Khmer Rouge fell, Cambodia eventually rebuilt its cities and industries, and much of that accidental environmental recovery was lost. But for a brief, strange window of time, one of the darkest chapters in history also created a kind of unintentional wildlife sanctuary across an entire country. So yes, the Khmer Rouge was a brutal, murderous regime, but in the process of tearing society apart, they gave the land a moment to breathe. It's one of history's eeriest silver linings, a reminder that nature doesn't need much from us to recover, just a little time without us getting in the way.
Idi Amin. Idi Amin was one of the most feared dictators of the 20th century, a man whose rule over Uganda in the 1970s was marked by mass killings, political repression, and enough bizarre behavior to fill a whole Netflix series. This is the guy who gave himself titles like Conqueror of the British Empire and claimed to have eaten his enemies. But here's the weird twist. During his rule, Uganda's wildlife actually got some of the best protection it's ever had. Uganda is home to some of the most spectacular animals in Africa. Lions, elephants, hippos, gorillas, and Amin knew that they were one of the country's greatest assets. So even though his government was collapsing in pretty much every other area, he made a point of protecting Uganda's national parks and game reserves. Poaching was a huge problem before Amin came to power, but he cracked down hard on it. He stationed military patrols in and around the parks, threatening poachers with severe punishment. Say what you will about Amin, and there's plenty to say, but his fearsome reputation worked. People were too scared to risk killing animals illegally, and wildlife populations actually grew during this time. The result? Uganda became a surprising hotspot for tourism. Safari trips and wildlife photography boomed. Travelers who dared to visit got to see some of the most abundant animal populations on the continent. For a while, Uganda's parks were considered some of the best in Africa. Of course, Amin wasn't exactly doing this out of pure love for giraffes. Protecting the parks was good PR. It made Uganda look like a well-run modern country to outsiders, something Amin desperately wanted the world to believe. And tourism brought in money, which he could then use to fund his regime. But here's the thing, the protection still worked. Even as Uganda was experiencing political chaos, its elephants and lions were thriving. In fact, some conservationists today look back on the Amin era as a rare window when wildlife was relatively safe. Not because of a well-funded conservation program, but because everyone was too terrified of the consequences of breaking the rules. After Amin was overthrown in 1979, poaching skyrocketed again, and many of those animal populations were devastated. It took decades to recover what was lost. Which means, ironically, that one of the most brutal dictators in Africa's history might have done more for Uganda's wildlife than some of his more democratic successors. So yes,
Idi Amin was a ruthless ruler responsible for unspeakable atrocities, but he also left behind a strange, accidental legacy, a period when Uganda's animals were safer than its people. It's one of those historical footnotes that makes you shake your head. The guy who terrified the world also made sure the zebras got to keep on grazing.
Muammar Qaddafi. Muammar Qaddafi is one of those leaders who left behind a very mixed legacy. He ruled Libya for over 40 years, crushed political opposition, gave rambling speeches that could last for hours, and was accused of funding terrorism abroad. But here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Qaddafi also built one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in history, something that literally turned parts of the Sahara green, the Great Man-Made River. Libya is mostly desert, and fresh water was always a huge challenge. Coastal cities relied on expensive desalination plants, and farming inland was almost impossible. Then, in the 1980s, Qaddafi launched a project that sounded completely insane at the time. Pump ancient underground water from aquifers deep under the Sahara and deliver it to cities and farms through a network of giant pipes. And when I say giant, I mean it. This thing became the largest irrigation project in the world. Thousands of miles of buried concrete pipelines, huge pumping stations and reservoirs were built to carry fresh water from the desert to the coast. When it was completed, the Great Man-Made River supplied millions of cubic meters of water every day. It provided drinking water for Libyan cities, irrigation for farms, and made it possible for parts of the desert to actually grow crops. For ordinary Libyans, this was a game changer. It meant access to clean water, more reliable agriculture, and less dependence on costly imported food. Qaddafi proudly called it the eighth wonder of the world. And to be fair, it was pretty impressive. Even foreign engineers who worked on the project admitted that it was a remarkable feat of planning and construction. Of course, nothing with Qaddafi was ever simple. The project cost billions of dollars, and critics argued it was as much about showing off his power as it was about helping the people. Some parts of the system were poorly maintained, and there were fears that draining the ancient aquifers could eventually cause long-term environmental problems. But for decades, the system worked, and it's still functioning today, providing water to Libyans even after Qaddafi's downfall. In a weird way, the Great Man-Made River is one of Qaddafi's most enduring legacies, more lasting than his political ideology, more useful than his endless speeches. It's one of the few things he did that just about everyone agrees made life better. So yes, Qaddafi was a dictator who ruled with fear and caused chaos at home and abroad. But he also pulled off one of the greatest public works projects in history. He didn't just dream of turning the desert into farmland. He actually did it, proving that even in one of the harshest environments on Earth, you can make water flow where there was none.
When you think of Joseph Stalin, you probably think of gulags, purges,
and one of the deadliest regimes in history. This is the man responsible for millions of deaths through forced labor, famine, and executions. But here's the strange twist. Stalin also played a big role in protecting Russia's wilderness, not because he was a tree hugger, but because he saw scientific value in it. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet Union created massive nature reserves known as zapovedniks. These weren't just pretty parks for picnics. They were meant to be completely untouched, strictly protected areas where scientists could study ecosystems in their natural state. No logging, no farming, no hunting, just nature left to do its thing. And Stalin actually supported this idea. Why? Partly because he understood that protecting natural resources was essential for the country's future. The USSR needed forests, rivers, and wildlife to stay healthy if it wanted to stay self-sufficient. But Stalin loved science when it served the state, and the zapovedniks were like living laboratories. Soviet scientists could study soil, climate, plants, and animals, which helped improve farming methods and resource management. These reserves were huge, millions of acres set aside across the Soviet Union, from Siberian tundra to Caucasus Mountains. They became some of the best preserved ecosystems in the world. Researchers studied everything from reindeer migrations to forest regeneration after fires. Their findings influenced not just Soviet policy, but global conservation science. Of course, this being Stalin, it wasn't all good news. During his purges, many of the very scientists who worked in these reserves were arrested, sent to gulags, or executed. Whole research teams were wiped out because they were accused of being politically unreliable. Some reserves were downsized or repurposed for agriculture when food shortages hit. Still, the core ideas survived, that some places should remain untouched for the sake of knowledge. After Stalin's death, the network of protected areas expanded even more, building on what had started under his rule. Today, Russia still has one of the largest systems of strict nature reserves in the world, many of them tracing their roots back to the Stalin era. It's a bizarre legacy. The man who ruled with fear and crushed dissent also preserved vast stretches of wilderness and advanced environmental science. It shows that even the most ruthless leaders sometimes make decisions that benefit future generations, whether they meant to or not. So yes, Stalin was one of history's harshest dictators, but he also left behind the system that kept parts of Russia's wilderness pristine for nearly a century. It's a strange thought that some of the most untouched, beautiful landscapes on Earth might owe their protection to a man who trusted no one and ruled by terror.
Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner is one of those figures who divides people, even today. On one hand, he was a musical genius whose operas revolutionized classical music. On the other hand, he was a raging anti-Semite whose writings were later embraced by the Nazis. It's a very uncomfortable combination, but you can't tell the story of music without him. Wagner's operas weren't just pretty music. They were massive, immersive spectacles. Before him, opera was often a series of catchy arias strung together. Wagner changed all that. He believed that music, drama, staging, and even the theater building itself should work together to create a single, overwhelming experience. He invented the idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. His music was groundbreaking. He used lush harmonies, powerful orchestration, and something called leitmotifs, short musical themes associated with specific characters, ideas, or emotions. If that sounds familiar, it's because movie composers still use this technique today. Think about how you can recognize Darth Vader just from a few notes of The Imperial Marcher. That idea started with Wagner, and audiences were blown away. His operas were long, intense, and dramatic, more like full-on cinematic universes before cinema even existed. The famous Ride of the Valkyries is still instantly recognizable, even to people who have never seen an opera. Wagner's influence stretched far beyond classical music, shaping film scores, symphonic writing, and even the way stories are told with music. But here's where it gets messy. Wagner was openly anti-Semitic, writing nasty essays about Jewish composers and culture. Decades after his death, Adolf Hitler became a fanboy and used Wagner's music as part of Nazi propaganda. It's one of those unfortunate cases where art got tangled up with ideology in a very ugly way. And yet the music itself remains powerful. You don't have to agree with Wagner's views to appreciate the emotional punch of his compositions. Conductors and musicians around the world still perform his works, even while acknowledging the toxic parts of his legacy. Some orchestras in Israel famously refuse to play Wagner, while others separate the man from the music. This is where history gets complicated. Wagner was not a good person by most accounts, arrogant, prejudiced, and unapologetic about it. But his music shaped the future of Western art. Without him, modern orchestral music and even the soundtracks we hear in movies might be completely different. So yes, Wagner was deeply flawed, and his views were dangerous. But he also left behind art that continues to move people over a century later. It's a reminder that sometimes brilliance and bigotry can coexist in the same person, and we're still figuring out how to deal with that today.
Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound might be one of the most complicated literary figures of the 20th century. On one hand, he was a brilliant poet and thinker who completely changed the way poetry was written. On the other hand, he openly supported fascism, praised Mussolini, and broadcast propaganda for Italy during World War II. It's the kind of combination that makes English professors sweat when they have to teach him. Let's start with the good part. Pound basically dragged poetry into the modern era. At a time when verse was still stuck in flowery Victorian language, he pushed for writing that was sharp, precise, and stripped down to the essentials. He helped launch the Imagist movement, which focused on clean, clear images, the kind of poetry that hits you like a snapshot instead of putting you to sleep with endless rhyming couplets. He also championed other writers.
Without Ezra Pound, we might not have had T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land in its final form. Pound edited it heavily and shaped it into a masterpiece. He supported James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and countless others, helping to create the modernist literary movement that defined an era. Pound had an eye for talent, and he used his influence to boost some of the greatest voices of the century. But then there's the darker side. Pound moved to Italy in the 1920s and became a full-on admirer of Benito Mussolini. He even met the dictator in person and thought he was brilliant. During World War II, Pound made radio broadcasts blaming the war on international bankers and, in deeply anti-Semitic rants, on Jews. After the war, he was arrested for treason and spent 12 years in a psychiatric hospital in Washington, D.C. It's a tough legacy to grapple with. On one hand, you have this literary genius who changed the way we read and write poetry. On the other, you have a man who aligned himself with one of the most destructive ideologies in history. But his influence on poetry is undeniable. Modern free verse, the idea that poetry can be short, sharp, and experimental, that's Pound's fingerprint. He told writers to make it new, and they did. Even if you've never read him, if you've ever read a poem that felt more like a lightning bolt than a lullaby, you felt his impact. So yes, Ezra Pound was a fascist sympathizer with some very ugly ideas, but he was also one of the most important poets of his generation. He left behind work that is still studied, argued about, and admired, even as people wrestle with the man behind the words. It's a reminder that art and artists can be painfully hard to separate, but sometimes the art is too influential to ignore.
Roman Polanski is one of the most controversial figures in film history. On one hand, he's a master director who made some of the most influential movies ever put on screen. On the other hand, he's a convicted criminal whose personal life has overshadowed his career for decades. It's one of those cases where separating the art from the artist isn't just tricky, it's a full-on ethical debate. Polanski's career as a filmmaker is undeniable. He directed classics like Rosemary's Baby, Chinatown, and The Pianist, movies that are still studied in film schools around the world. He had a gift for atmosphere, for turning ordinary settings into something unsettling and unforgettable. His movies often explore paranoia, moral corruption, and the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Take Chinatown, for example. It's one of the greatest neo-noir films ever made, a detective story that's as much about human greed and power as it is about solving a crime. Or The Pianist, his haunting portrayal of survival during the Holocaust, which won him an Academy Award for Best Director. These films aren't just entertainment. They're considered masterpieces that help define what modern cinema can be. But Polanski's personal life is where things get complicated. In 1977, he was arrested and charged with unlawful sexual intercourse with a 13-year-old girl. He pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, but fled the United States before sentencing, and has lived in exile ever since.
This has made him a deeply polarizing figure. Some refuse to watch his films entirely, while others argue that his work still deserves recognition regardless of his crimes. And yet, Hollywood has continued to acknowledge his talent. He has won numerous awards, including an Oscar, and his movies still draw critical praise. Film scholars often separate their discussion of Polanski's work from his personal life, focusing on his contributions to the craft, his meticulous framing, his use of tension, and his ability to draw unforgettable performances from actors. Whether you think he should still be celebrated or not, there's no question that Polanski shaped modern filmmaking. Directors like Quentin Tarantino, David Fincher, and Ari Aster have cited his work as inspiration. If you've seen a psychological thriller where the tension slowly builds until it's unbearable, you're seeing Polanski's influence at work. So yes, Roman Polanski's personal actions are inexcusable and cast a long shadow over his legacy. But his films are still dissected, taught, and admired for their artistry. It's one of those uncomfortable truths in art history. Sometimes great works come from deeply flawed people, and deciding what to do with that fact is left to each viewer.
Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson is one of the most famous and infamous boxers of all time. He was the youngest heavyweight champion in history, a knockout machine who seemed unstoppable in the ring. But outside of it, Tyson's life was a tabloid roller coaster. Arrests, scandals, a prison sentence for rape, and a public image that went from terrifying to tragic to somehow strangely lovable. And one of the most surprising twists in his story? These days, Iron Mike is a big advocate for peace, at least when it comes to kids and animals. Tyson grew up in a tough neighborhood, bullied relentlessly for his lisp and high-pitched voice. He started fighting back, literally, and by his teens, he was already becoming a boxing prodigy. But his early life left scars. He's talked about how being bullied shaped him and made him angry. That's part of what fueled the aggression that made him a champion, but it also got him into trouble. Fast forward to today, and Tyson has flipped that story on its head. He speaks openly about his past and encourages kids not to follow the same path. He's partnered with anti-bullying campaigns, talking about how violence and revenge didn't fix his problems, it just made them worse. Hearing a guy once feared as the baddest man on the planet tell kids to walk away from fights hits differently. And then there's his love of animals. Tyson has gone vegan in recent years and speaks passionately about animal rights. He's been involved in campaigns against animal cruelty and has said that he wants to use his platform to protect those who can't protect themselves. This is the same guy who once owned pet tigers. Yes, actual tigers. But now he's about saving animals, not keeping them as status symbols. It's part of a larger transformation Tyson has gone through. After prison, bankruptcy, and years of personal chaos, he seems to have found a kind of peace. He's even become a pop culture figure again,
appearing in movies, doing comedy shows, and charming audiences with his surprisingly soft-spoken personality. None of this erases his past. Tyson is still a convicted felon, and his crimes are serious, but he's also someone who's tried to use his second act to do something positive. He talks about mental health, about breaking cycles of violence, and about forgiveness, including forgiving himself. So yeah, Mike Tyson is complicated. He was once the scariest man alive, but now he's more likely to be found telling kids to stay in school and stop bullying each other, or petting a pigeon and talking about kindness. It's one of those redemption arcs that feels almost too strange to be true, but maybe that's why it works. Because if Mike Tyson can change, maybe anybody can.
Chris Brown might be one of the most controversial names in pop music. He's a Grammy-winning artist, an incredible dancer, and a guy who dominated the charts with hit after hit. But he's also infamous for his 2009 assault on Rihanna, an incident that still follows him to this day. That moment nearly destroyed his career, and for many fans, it permanently changed how they saw him. But here's the twist that doesn't always make headlines. Chris Brown has since donated to and supported domestic violence awareness programs. He's funded outreach efforts, partnered with organizations focused on prevention, and has spoken, carefully, about the importance of education around abuse. It's a strange, complicated move. The man who became the face of celebrity domestic violence, using his money to help fight the very problem he once embodied. After the assault, Brown went through court-ordered counseling, community service, and probation. It wasn't just a legal slap on the wrist. He was under intense public scrutiny. His every move was criticized, and his music was boycotted by radio stations. Brown has said that the experience forced him to face what he did and think about how he wanted to be remembered. Supporting awareness programs may have started as damage control, but over time it became part of how he tries to reshape his legacy. Some of his efforts have included funding shelters, supporting youth programs that teach conflict resolution, and speaking about the importance of controlling anger. Of course, critics argue that no amount of charity erases what happened, and they're right. Brown's actions were serious, and he's had other incidents since then that make people question how much he's actually changed. But for the people who benefit from the programs he's funded, the help is real. Victims get resources, teens get education on healthy relationships, and communities get conversations about a topic that often stays in the dark. It's a rare case where someone who caused harm puts money back into preventing others from doing the same. This doesn't mean everyone has forgiven him. Chris Brown remains one of the most polarizing figures in pop culture. Some fans still support him wholeheartedly. Others refuse to listen to his music at all. His legacy is complicated, part superstar, part cautionary tale. But there's no denying that his contributions have had a positive impact on awareness and education about domestic violence. Whether it's redemption, PR strategy, or a mix of both, it shows that even deeply flawed people can end up funding something good. So yes, Chris Brown will always have that dark chapter in his story, but he's also tried, in his own way, to make sure fewer people end up with one like it. It's one of those uncomfortable truths where good can come from a very bad place. Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson is one of Hollywood's most complicated figures. He went from being one of the biggest movie stars and directors in the world, think Braveheart, Lethal Weapon, Mad Max, to being publicly disgraced after a series of scandals, including racist and anti-Semitic rants that nearly ended his career. But here's something that doesn't get as much attention. Gibson has quietly poured millions into Catholic charities and historical preservation projects. Gibson has always been outspoken about his faith, and he's put his money where his mouth is. He's donated to organizations that support Catholic education, fund missions, and provide aid to people in need. One of his biggest contributions was bankrolling the construction of the Holy Family Chapel in California, a traditional Latin Mass chapel he built from scratch for his local community. But his giving goes beyond religion. Gibson has funded efforts to preserve historic buildings and sites, particularly ones with cultural or religious significance. He supported restoration projects for centuries-old churches, including work in places like Central America, where preserving these sites also helps local communities and tourism. For him, this isn't just charity, it's a way to keep history alive and pass on traditions to future generations. And this isn't something he shouts from the rooftops. Unlike some celebrities who publicize every donation, Gibson tends to keep his philanthropy low-key. He rarely gives interviews about it, and a lot of the information comes from the organizations themselves, not from him. Of course, none of this erases the things he said during his infamous meltdowns in the mid-2000s. His public image took a beating after those incidents, and for many people, that's still what they think of when they hear his name. But Gibson has tried to repair his reputation over the years, both personally and professionally. Directing Hacksaw Ridge was part of that comeback, and it earned him an Oscar nomination. The donations and preservation work show a side of him that doesn't make the headlines. A man who cares about his faith, about history, and about supporting causes he believes in. Whether you see it as redemption, genuine generosity, or both, the impact is real. It's one of those situations where a person's life is messy, but their good deeds still have value. The chapel he built still holds services. The historic sites he helped save are still standing. And the charities he funded are still helping people. So yes, Mel Gibson has had some very public low points, but he's also done a lot of good behind the scenes. And those actions will probably outlast the tabloid scandals. He's a reminder that some legacies are complicated, with both darkness and light carved into them.
Kanye West. Kanye West is one of those names that sparks instant debate. He's a music icon, a fashion mogul, and a guy whose public statements have ranged from genius-level insight to full-on, "did he really just say that?" moments. His controversies, from storming award shows to incendiary political remarks, often overshadow everything else. But here's something people sometimes forget. Kanye has donated millions to education initiatives, quietly funding programs to help kids get opportunities he never had.
Kanye grew up on the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who was an English professor. Education was a big deal in his house, and that seems to have stuck with him. Over the years, he's supported scholarships, after-school programs, and initiatives aimed at improving literacy and access to technology for underprivileged kids. One of his most personal projects was the Kanye West Foundation, which focused on keeping kids in school and reducing dropout rates. The foundation partnered with schools to create music education programs and workshops designed to inspire creativity. Kanye also funded efforts to improve arts education, believing that creativity can keep kids engaged and out of trouble. Even after the foundation shut down, Kanye has continued to give. He's donated to black colleges, supported relief funds for struggling families, and helped cover tuition costs for students who couldn't afford it. During times of crisis, like the pandemic, he contributed to programs that delivered meals to students who relied on school lunches. And here's the thing, he doesn't always publicize it. A lot of these donations came out later through reports from the organizations themselves. For all the times Kanye grabs headlines for saying something outrageous, there are plenty of times he's quietly writing checks to help kids get a shot at a better future. Of course, none of this erases the fact that Kanye has had some very public meltdowns and made statements that left even his fans shaking their heads. He's a polarizing figure, and his reputation has taken a lot of hits in recent years. But his philanthropy shows another side, one that genuinely cares about giving back, especially to young people growing up in tough environments like the one he came from. It's a reminder that people are rarely just one thing. Kanye can be a provocateur and a philanthropist at the same time. A guy who stirs controversy, but also uses his wealth to open doors for kids who might otherwise be left behind. So yes, Kanye West might always be surrounded by drama, but in between the headlines, he's helped a lot of kids stay in school, chase their passions, and imagine something bigger for their lives. And that part of his legacy doesn't make the gossip blogs, but maybe it should.
Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson might have been the most famous person on the planet at one point, the king of pop, the man who gave us Thriller, Billie Jean, and the Moonwalk. But his life was also full of controversy, lawsuits, and endless tabloid drama that still spark debates today. What often gets lost in all that noise is just how much he quietly gave away, including building children's hospitals, funding charities, and secretly paying for scholarships for kids he'd never even met. Jackson was passionate about children's health and education. He donated tens of millions of dollars over his lifetime to children's hospitals around the world, sometimes visiting them in person to meet patients. He didn't just write checks. He actually funded equipment, playgrounds, and research programs. At one point, he even had plans to build a massive children's hospital that would focus on advanced care and child-friendly design, though that project never fully materialized. He was also a serial scholarship funder. There are countless stories of Jackson quietly paying tuition for kids in need, covering college costs for fans he met in person, and supporting entire schools without asking for publicity. Often, the only reason we even know about these acts is because recipients later came forward to share what he'd done. One example that stands out: Jackson paid for the education of a young boy who survived a brutal accident after hearing about his story on the news. Another time, he funded a full scholarship for an aspiring artist who had written to him for help. These weren't PR stunts. They were private gestures that only came to light years later. And then there was Heal the World, his charitable foundation that worked on everything from children's immunizations to disaster relief. Jackson saw himself not just as an entertainer, but as someone who could use his fame to do something good. He even visited war zones and orphanages, bringing supplies and sometimes just bringing joy. Of course, Michael Jackson's personal life has been endlessly scrutinized, and allegations about his behavior around children have left a lasting shadow. Some people see his philanthropy as sincere. Others see it as complicated in light of the accusations. But no matter how you view him, the impact of his giving is real. Thousands of kids benefited from his donations, whether through medical care, education, or simply having a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. So yes, Michael Jackson was a deeply controversial figure, but he was also one of the most generous celebrities of his time. He didn't just sing about healing the world. He put a lot of money and effort into actually doing it. Whether you see him as a flawed genius or a tragic figure, there's no denying that his legacy includes both incredible music and a whole lot of good quietly done behind the scenes.
Marlon Brando was already a Hollywood legend by the 1970s. The brooding bad boy from A Street Named Desire, the motorcycle rebel from The Wild One, and of course, the Godfather himself. But when he won the Oscar for The Godfather in 1973, he didn't just show up, smile, and say thank you. Instead, he turned the biggest night in Hollywood into one of the most unexpected political moments in Academy Awards history. Brando had been outspoken about Native American rights for years, angry about how indigenous people were treated in movies and in real life. Westerns often portrayed Native Americans as villains or stereotypes, and Hollywood rarely gave them a chance to tell their own stories. So when Brando was announced as the winner for Best Actor, he refused to accept the award and sent someone else in his place. That someone was Sacheen Littlefeather, a Native American activist and actress. She walked on stage, turned down the Oscar, and gave a short but powerful speech about how Hollywood misrepresented Native Americans and how the federal government was mistreating them at places like Wounded Knee, where there was an ongoing standoff at the time. The audience was stunned. Some people booed, others clapped, and the moment became front-page news the next day. Brando later released a 15-page statement explaining why he refused the award, arguing that it was time for change in how indigenous people were portrayed in film and treated in society. Whether you agreed with his stunt or not, it worked.
It forced millions of people to confront an issue they probably weren't thinking about while watching the Oscars. It also cost Brando professionally. Some studios were furious, and he was labeled as difficult to work with, though, to be fair, he already had that reputation. But the moment became iconic. Today, it's remembered as one of the most political statements ever made on live television, years before celebrities regularly used award shows to speak out. It also inspired more indigenous representation and awareness in Hollywood, even if change was slow. Brando didn't stop there. He continued to advocate for Native rights, donated to organizations supporting indigenous communities, and stayed involved in activism for the rest of his life. It wasn't a one-time publicity stunt. It was part of his larger belief that fame should be used for something bigger than just collecting trophies. So yes, Marlon Brando could be eccentric, demanding, and even difficult. But he also used one of the biggest moments of his career to shine a spotlight on a group of people Hollywood had spent decades ignoring. It was risky, bold, and way ahead of its time. It turned a gold statue into a statement.
Sean Penn. Sean Penn has always been a bit of a Hollywood wild card. He's an Oscar-winning actor with serious talent. Mystic River, Milk, you name it. But he's also been known for some very public anger issues. In the 80s and 90s, Penn was practically the poster child for celebrity meltdowns, with bar fights, paparazzi scuffles, and a reputation for having the shortest fuse in the business. But here's the part of Sean Penn's story that might surprise you. He has done some of the most hands-on humanitarian work of any A-list celebrity. When the 2010 earthquake devastated Haiti, Penn didn't just send thoughts and prayers. He got on a plane, flew down there, and stayed. Penn founded an organization called JPHRO, later renamed CORE, which set up and ran one of the largest refugee camps in Port-au-Prince. We're talking tens of thousands of displaced people getting food, medical care, and shelter, all coordinated with Penn living on site. He didn't just show up for a photo op and leave. He was there for months, working alongside aid workers, helping with logistics, and even driving trucks full of supplies himself. And he didn't stop when the cameras left. Penn's organization stayed in Haiti for years, helping with rebuilding efforts, education, and healthcare. When Hurricane Matthew hit in 2016, they were there again, distributing aid. He's also expanded CORE's mission to include disaster relief around the world, including during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the group set up free testing and vaccination sites across the United States. It's a pretty striking contrast. The same guy who once made headlines for punching photographers is now the guy coordinating life-saving relief efforts. Penn himself has admitted that this work gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before, and many aid workers have credited him with making a real difference. Of course, Sean Penn is still Sean Penn, outspoken, intense, and sometimes polarizing. His interviews can be fiery, and his approach to politics and activism has rubbed people the wrong way. But even critics have a hard time denying that his humanitarian work is the real deal. The Haiti effort in particular earned him international recognition and even praise from government officials who said he filled a critical gap in aid response. That's not something you can fake. So yes, Sean Penn is the guy who once terrified paparazzi photographers. But he's also the guy who turned around and spent years helping rebuild an entire country after one of the worst natural disasters of the century. It's a reminder that redemption doesn't always come from a quiet apology. Sometimes it comes from showing up, rolling up your sleeves, and doing the hard work when the world isn't watching.
L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard is one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. The science fiction writer who founded Scientology, wrote Dianetics, and built a movement that's either seen as a religion or a cult, depending on who you ask. But here's a lesser-known part of his story. Hubbard also launched drug rehabilitation programs that have actually helped some people get clean, most famously the program called Narconon. Hubbard had strong views about the dangers of drugs and toxins in the body. In the 1960s, as recreational drug use was exploding, he developed what he called the Purification Rundown, a detox method involving exercise, sweating in saunas, vitamins, and a strict regimen to flush out harmful substances. It was controversial, and still is, but it became the basis for Narconon, a drug rehab program started in 1966. Narconon centers popped up around the world, offering an alternative to traditional rehabilitation programs. Their approach is based on Hubbard's teachings, heavy focus on detoxification, life skills training, and discipline. Supporters claim it has helped thousands of people break free from addiction. Some graduates have gone on to run their own treatment centers, crediting the program for saving their lives. Of course, Narconon isn't without criticism. Mainstream medical professionals have raised concerns about the lack of scientific evidence behind some of its methods, and its ties to Scientology have made it controversial. Lawsuits have accused the program of being more about recruiting people into the church than about treating addiction. So, like much of Hubbard's legacy, it's complicated. Still, it's hard to ignore the fact that Narconon has been running for over 50 years and continues to operate in dozens of countries. For many who've gone through the program, the experience was life-changing, and not in a religious way, just in a "I finally got sober" way. Hubbard himself saw the fight against drugs as part of a larger mission to improve society. He wrote extensively about how drug use damaged not just the body, but also the spirit, and he believed that clearing those toxins was a key step toward personal freedom. Whether you buy into that philosophy or not, it's clear he was serious about tackling addiction. So, yes, L. Ron Hubbard might be best known for starting Scientology, space opera-level theology and all, but he also founded a program that has given some people a second chance at life. Like a lot of things connected to him, it's a mix of controversy, devotion, and results that are hard to argue with if you are one of the people it helped. It's one of those weird moments where a polarizing figure leaves behind something undeniably positive, even if the road there is a little bumpy.
David Miscavige. David Miscavige is one of the most mysterious and polarizing figures in religion today. He's the leader of the Church of Scientology, a man who took over after L. Ron Hubbard's death and turned the organization into a global empire. He's been accused of being ruthless, secretive, and controlling, and plenty of documentaries have taken shots at him. But here's something that gets less attention. Under his leadership, Scientology has funded massive literacy programs around the world. One of Scientology's big missions has always been improving education, and Miscavige has put serious money and resources into it. The church runs programs like Applied Scholastics, which promote Hubbard's study methods to help people learn more effectively. These programs have been set up in schools, prisons, and community centers in dozens of countries. The idea is pretty simple. Teach people how to learn literally. Hubbard developed techniques like word clearing, which focus on making sure students really understand what they're reading, instead of just memorizing words. Whether or not you agree with the philosophy, plenty of teachers and students who've used the system say it helped them boost literacy and stay in school. Scientology-backed literacy campaigns have handed out millions of free booklets, trained teachers, and launched community projects in some of the poorest parts of the world. They've worked in countries struggling with high illiteracy rates, like parts of Africa and South America, giving kids and adults the tools to actually read and write for the first time. Of course, critics say these programs are just a way to recruit new members and spread Scientology's influence, and that's where things get messy. Some educators are wary about using materials tied to a controversial religious movement. Still, for the people who go through the programs and learn to read, the results can be life-changing. Miscavige has framed literacy as one of Scientology's core humanitarian efforts, often highlighting it in public events. And it's not just talk. The church has poured millions into publishing and distributing educational materials. Some independent studies have even found improvements in reading comprehension for students who've gone through the program. Like a lot of things connected to Scientology, this is one of those both things can be true situations. Yes, the church has faced accusations of abuse and manipulation. But yes, it has also helped tens of thousands of people learn to read. So David Miscavige remains one of those figures whose legacy is complicated. Part feared religious leader, part global education advocate. Love him or hate him, there's no denying that under his watch, Scientology has put an unusual amount of energy into fighting illiteracy. And for the people who can now pick up a book for the first time, that effort made a real difference.
Jim Jones. Jim Jones is a name that pretty much everyone associates with one thing: Jonestown, the mass suicide that claimed over 900 lives in 1978 and became the origin of the phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid." It's one of the darkest stories in modern history. But before Jones turned into a cult leader whose paranoia destroyed everything, he actually did some good, and a lot of it. Back in the 1950s and 60s, Jones was a rising star in progressive activism. He founded the People's Temple as a Christian church that focused on equality, social justice, and helping the poor. At a time when much of America was still segregated, Jones was one of the few white preachers who openly welcomed black congregants and pushed for full integration. He didn't just talk about equality, he practiced it. The People's Temple ran free food programs, job training classes, and community kitchens. They helped the homeless find housing, paid medical bills for struggling families, and set up programs for seniors who couldn't afford care. Jones made his church a place where the marginalized could find dignity and support. One of the most radical things he did was challenge segregation head-on. He and his congregation would go into all-white restaurants in Indiana and refuse to leave until they were served. He pushed local hospitals to integrate, adopting children of different races himself as a way to set an example. For many people in his community, Jones was a hero, someone finally willing to fight for civil rights in a deeply conservative state. And it worked. The People's Temple grew, attracting people who were passionate about social change. Members felt they were part of something bigger than themselves, a movement that could reshape society. In those early years, it was hard to argue with the results. Hungry people were being fed, sick people were getting care, and racial barriers were being broken. But of course, that's not where the story ends. Jones's good works eventually got mixed with his growing ego, paranoia, and obsession with control. What started as a progressive church turned into a cult, and the utopian dream became a nightmare that ended in tragedy. That's what makes Jones such a complicated figure. He wasn't a villain from the beginning. He was a man who actually made life better for thousands of people before everything went off the rails. His early work with food programs and racial integration left a lasting impact on the communities he served. It's a chilling reminder of how good intentions can morph into something dangerous when power goes unchecked. Jones fed the hungry, fought racism, and gave hope, and then led those same hopeful people into disaster. It's a story that proves doing good and doing harm can sometimes exist in the very same person.
Shoko Asahara is one of the most infamous cult leaders of the 20th century, the man behind Aum Shinrikyo, the doomsday cult that carried out the deadly 1995 Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. That single act of terrorism shocked Japan and made Aum Shinrikyo a household name for all the wrong reasons. But here's the strange part. Before his group became synonymous with mass murder, Asahara and his followers actually did humanitarian work, including delivering aid after natural disasters. In the early days, Aum Shinrikyo wasn't just a death cult plotting Armageddon. It started as a spiritual yoga and meditation group, attracting young people who were disillusioned with Japan's high-pressure, work-obsessed society. They preached about enlightenment, health, and living a more meaningful life, and they backed it up with action. One of the most surprising things they did was organize disaster relief efforts. After several major earthquakes in Japan, Aum volunteers traveled to affected areas, bringing food, water, and medical supplies. They helped clean up debris, provided shelter, and offered free healing sessions to victims. For a lot of people at the time, Aum Shinrikyo looked like a group of compassionate, disciplined young idealists who were doing the kind of work governments were often too slow to handle. This humanitarian side is part of why Aum Shinrikyo grew so quickly. People saw them not just as a religious sect, but as a community that cared. College graduates, scientists, and doctors joined because they believed they were part of a movement that could make the world better. Of course, this makes what happened later all the more chilling.
Asahara's teachings got darker, more apocalyptic, and eventually violent. He convinced his followers that a coming world war was inevitable and that they needed to prepare, even by launching attacks themselves. The group's shift from serving earthquake victims to releasing poison gas on commuters is one of the starkest transformations of any organization in modern history. But that early humanitarian work shouldn't be erased because it helps explain why so many intelligent, well-meaning people got involved in the first place. They saw real good being done, meals delivered, homes rebuilt, and thought they were joining a force for positive change. It's a stark reminder that dangerous movements often start by doing good. They win trust, build credibility, and attract people with genuine kindness before pulling them into something much darker. So yes, Shoko Asahara will always be remembered as the man who unleashed terror on Tokyo, but before that, he and his group were the ones bringing aid to earthquake victims when no one else was there. It's one of the most unsettling examples of how good deeds can hide a much darker purpose, at least until the mask comes off.
Bhagwan Rajneesh. Bhagwan Shri Rajneesh, better known as Osho, might be one of the most fascinating cult figures in the 20th century. To some, he was a spiritual teacher who preached freedom, meditation, and living life to the fullest. To others, he was a dangerous cult leader who nearly took over an American town. But one thing that's hard to deny, under his guidance, his followers built an entire functioning city in the middle of the Oregon desert, and it was surprisingly ahead of its time. In the early 1980s, Rajneesh and thousands of his disciples bought a massive ranch in rural Oregon and set out to create a utopian community called Rajneeshpuram. And this wasn't some hippie campground with tents and a campfire. They went all in. They built roads, homes, a dam, a sewage system, a power grid, restaurants, meditation halls, and even an airport. They turned a barren piece of land into a self-sustaining city, complete with public transport, farming, and modern infrastructure. At its peak, Rajneeshpuram had thousands of residents, its own police force, and its own newspaper. The community grew much of its own food, ran large-scale composting programs, and focused on sustainability long before it became a buzzword. For a brief period, it was one of the most organized and successful intentional communities in the world. And honestly, the engineering was impressive. They built massive greenhouses to grow vegetables year-round, managed water resources efficiently in a very dry climate, and even developed free cycling programs. In many ways, they were experimenting with ideas about sustainable living that wouldn't go mainstream until decades later. Of course, this story isn't just about urban planning. It's also about power struggles, lawsuits, and famously, the largest bioterror attack in US history, when some members of the group tried to poison a local town's salad bars to sway an election. Yeah, things went downhill fast. The utopian dream started to unravel under political pressure, internal conflicts, and criminal activity by the commune's leadership. Eventually, Rajneesh was deported, the city dissolved, and the whole experiment became the stuff of documentaries. But the fact remains, for a few years, Rajneesh and his followers built something remarkable. They proved that you could create a thriving city from scratch, powered by idealism, hard work, and a lot of bulldozers. Even critics admitted that the scale of what they achieved in such a remote and hostile location was astonishing. So yes, Bhagwan Rajneesh was a controversial figure whose movement ended in scandal,
But he also oversaw the creation of a functioning city that was cleaner, greener, and more organized than many towns built the conventional way. It's one of those weird moments in history where a spiritual movement accidentally became an impressive feat of civil engineering.
Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate is one of the most infamous cults in American history. The group, whose members all wore matching Nikes, covered themselves with purple shrouds, and committed mass suicide in 1997, believing their souls were going to hitch a ride on a UFO behind the Hale-Bopp comet. It's a story that's so bizarre it feels like science fiction. But here's the lesser-known side of Heaven's Gate. Before things got dark, they encouraged their members to live simply, tread lightly on the planet, and take care of the environment. The group, led by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, had a philosophy that rejected materialism and consumer culture. They believed Earth was just a temporary stop on their spiritual journey, so they tried to leave as little impact as possible. Members were encouraged to live communally, share resources, and avoid unnecessary waste. They practiced what they preached. Heaven's Gate members lived in modest houses, ate a largely vegetarian diet, and tried to keep their lives free of excess. They didn't just say, consume less, they actually did it, giving up personal possessions and focusing on a minimalist lifestyle. In a weird way, they were decades ahead of the zero-waste and tiny house movements. This environmental consciousness wasn't about saving the Earth for future generations. They fully expected to leave the planet behind. But they believed in respecting the planet while they were here. They avoided harming animals whenever possible, recycled, and kept their living spaces clean and organized. Their teachings also emphasized staying away from polluting behaviors, not just physically, but spiritually. They talked about keeping the body and mind uncontaminated, which meant eating clean, staying sober, and avoiding anything they thought would cloud their thinking. The end result was a group that was surprisingly disciplined, tidy, and eco-conscious, at least before their beliefs took them to a much darker place. Of course, none of this erases the tragedy of how it all ended. The mass suicide of 39 members was shocking and heartbreaking, and it's what Heaven's Gate will always be remembered for. But the way they lived day to day shows that they weren't just wild-eyed doomsday fanatics. They were people trying, in their own unusual way, to live in harmony with each other and with the planet. It's one of those eerie reminders that dangerous groups often have parts of their philosophy that sound reasonable or even admirable at first. Heaven's Gate combined ideas about discipline, simplicity, and environmental respect with an apocalyptic belief system that ultimately turned deadly. So, yes, Heaven's Gate will forever be remembered for its tragic end. But along the way, it modeled a lifestyle of shared resources, vegetarian cooking, and conscious living that wouldn't look out of place in a modern sustainability blog. Strange, but true. Charles Manson. Charles Manson is practically the poster child for cult leaders gone wrong. He's remembered for the Tate LaBianca murders, the Helter-Skelter conspiracy, and one of the most disturbing crime stories in American history. But here's the bizarre twist. Even after he was locked up, Manson became a hardcore environmental activist. He called his movement ATWA, which stood for Air, Trees, Water,
animals. Manson preached that humans were destroying the planet and that we needed to stop polluting the environment before it killed us all. And honestly, that part wasn't entirely wrong. He warned about pollution, climate change, and mass extinction decades before those became mainstream concerns. From prison, Manson wrote letters, gave interviews, and sent out artwork all centered around environmental themes. He talked about how Earth was a living organism and that humans were acting like a disease. He pushed the idea that we needed to reconnect with nature, protect animals, and live in balance with the planet. Some of his followers, yes, even after the murders, took this message seriously and tried to promote environmental causes under the ATWA name. Now, let's be clear, this doesn't make Manson a hero. The man orchestrated brutal killings and manipulated young people into doing horrific things. But it is weirdly fascinating that in between ranting about the apocalypse, he was also talking about saving the trees and cleaning up rivers. And some of what he said actually lined up with mainstream environmentalism. He railed against overpopulation, industrial waste, and the destruction of wildlife habitats. He argued that humans needed to radically change the way we lived, or we'd end up wiping ourselves out. It was part eco-philosophy, part doomsday prophecy, but it did get people thinking. Even today, the ATWA name survives in small activist circles, mostly separate from Manson's darker legacy. Some people focus purely on the ecological message, promoting animal rights and environmental preservation, while trying to ignore where it came from. Manson's environmentalism is one of those strange footnotes in history that makes you go, wait, the guy who inspired a murderous cult was also worried about pollution? It's the ultimate example of how even the most twisted figures can latch on to something true. So yes, Charles Manson was a manipulative cult leader whose crimes shocked the world, but he also left behind a weirdly sincere message about protecting the planet. It's one of those moments where you have to separate the idea from the man, because the idea that we should protect air, trees, water, and animals actually isn't bad at all. The messenger, though, absolutely terrifying.
Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan is one of the most controversial figures in American public life. As the longtime leader of the Nation of Islam, he's been accused of anti-Semitism, homophobia, and spreading conspiracy theories. But here's a side of the story that doesn't get as much attention. Under his leadership, the Nation of Islam created programs that actually lowered crime and improved life in some struggling black communities. The Nation of Islam has always emphasized discipline, self-reliance, and community improvement. In neighborhoods dealing with poverty, drugs, and violence, they set up programs that encouraged people to clean up their lives, literally and figuratively. They ran drug rehab initiatives, started businesses, taught job skills, and provided security for local housing projects. One of the most visible efforts came in the 1990s when the Nation of Islam signed contracts with housing authorities in several cities to provide security in public housing. Residents reported that crime dropped significantly when the Fruit of Islam, the group's security wing, patrolled their buildings. They were strict, but effective, focusing on keeping drug dealers out and protecting residents who just wanted a safe place to live. Farrakhan also promoted healthy eating, self-education, and strong family structures within the community. His speeches often called for an end to gang violence and encouraged young men to take responsibility for their lives instead of getting caught up in crime. For many people, joining the Nation of Islam was a way out of addiction or street life, a path to stability when few other options were available. And it worked for a lot of people. There are countless stories of former gang members who credit the movement with saving their lives. Some became business owners, activists, or mentors to the next generation. Farrakhan's critics may hate what he says about certain groups, but even they sometimes acknowledge the tangible results his programs achieved in inner cities. Of course, none of this erases the controversy. Farrakhan's anti-Semitic remarks have been condemned by leaders across the political spectrum, and his conspiracy-laced rhetoric has kept him a deeply polarizing figure. For some, his positive contributions to Black communities can't outweigh the harm caused by his divisive language. But it's one of those complicated legacies where both things are true. Farrakhan has said deeply offensive things, and the movement he leads has made life measurably better for thousands of people. Crime went down, neighborhoods got safer, and some people got a second chance because of programs he pushed. So yes, Louis Farrakhan is a deeply controversial figure, but he's also a man whose efforts helped transform lives for the better. It's a reminder that history's most polarizing figures often leave behind legacies that are messy, part harm, part healing.
The Westboro Baptist Church. The Westboro Baptist Church might be one of the most hated groups in America. They're infamous for their shocking protests, picketing funerals, holding offensive signs, and saying things designed to make everyone as angry as possible. Most people would agree they're offensive, cruel, and downright hateful. But here's the strange twist. Their actions accidentally strengthened one of the most important free speech protections in modern U.S. law. Back in 2006, Westboro members picketed the funeral of Matthew Snyder, a Marine who died in Iraq. They held their usual inflammatory signs, blaming everything from America's military deaths to natural disasters on society's sins. The Snyder family was devastated and sued the church for emotional distress. And initially, they won a multi-million-dollar verdict. But Westboro appealed, and the case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. In 2011, the court ruled 8-1 in Snyder v. Phelps that Westboro's protests, as hateful as they were protected under the First Amendment because they addressed matters of public concern and took place on public property. That decision set a major legal precedent. It reaffirmed that even speech we despise, even speech designed to hurt, is still protected under the Constitution. Free speech isn't just for polite conversation or popular opinions. It's also for the voices we'd rather not hear. It's a weird paradox. A group almost everyone agrees is toxic ended up reinforcing one of the cornerstones of American freedom. Lawyers and civil liberties advocates point to this case as a key moment where the courts chose to defend the principle of free expression, no matter how ugly it gets. Of course, this doesn't mean people started liking Westboro. Their protests still sparked outrage, counter-protests, and countless memes. But in a strange way, they forced the country to have an uncomfortable conversation about where the line should be between offensive speech and legal censorship. And the Supreme Court came down firmly on the side of protecting speech. For defenders of the First Amendment, that ruling was a big win. It meant that no matter how unpopular your opinion, you still have the right to express it without the government shutting you down. And that protection applies to everyone, not just hateful groups, but also activists, journalists, and regular people who might one day need the law on their side. So, yes, the Westboro Baptist Church is still one of the most despised groups in America, but they also accidentally help make sure everyone's right to speak, even to say outrageous things, is stronger than before. It's the ultimate case of a villain doing something that benefits everyone else, even if that was never their goal.
Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is one of the most polarizing figures in history. The founding father of the People's Republic of China, the man behind the Cultural Revolution, and a leader whose policies led to both massive social change and catastrophic famines. But one part of Mao's legacy that's hard to deny is this. Under his rule, literacy rates in China skyrocketed. When Mao came to power in 1949, China was still largely a peasant society. Most of the population lived in rural villages, and the majority couldn't read or write. Education was a luxury, often reserved for the wealthy or for boys in certain regions. Mao believed that to build a modern socialist state, everyone needed to be educated, not just the elite. So he launched mass literacy campaigns across the country. Teachers were sent to villages, night schools were set up for adults, and new textbooks were created that were simple, practical, and full of revolutionary slogans. Reading wasn't just about learning characters, it was about learning ideology. But whatever the motivation, it worked. By the 1970s, China's literacy rate had more than doubled. Millions of peasants who had never held a book before could now read newspapers, keep written records, and participate in political life. For many women especially, this was the first time education was truly accessible, a huge shift in a society where they'd often been left out. Of course, Mao being Mao, there was a catch. The education was highly political. Students learned to read from revolutionary texts and Mao's own little red book. Dissenting ideas were banned, and teachers who resisted the new system were sometimes denounced or worse. But even so, the campaigns gave basic literacy to a population that had been left behind for centuries. This investment in education paid off in the long run. China's ability to industrialize and modernize in later decades was built on the foundation of a more literate, better educated population. The same peasants who once couldn't sign their names became workers, engineers, and scientists who helped push China forward. It's one of those strange historical ironies.
a man responsible for so much upheaval and tragedy, also gave millions of people the gift of reading. Literacy rates in China today hover near 100%, and Mao's early campaigns are a big reason why. So yes, Mao Zedong's rule was marked by political purges, famine, and chaos. But he also made sure that ordinary people could pick up a newspaper and actually understand it. In a country where knowledge had long been a privilege of the few, that was a revolution all by itself.
Augusto Pinochet. Augusto Pinochet is one of those names that instantly sparks debate. He was the military dictator who seized power in Chile in a 1973 coup, ruled with an iron fist for 17 years, and oversaw thousands of arrests, disappearances, and executions. But here's the twist. During his time in power, Pinochet also implemented sweeping economic reforms that transformed Chile's economy and helped lay the foundation for the country's later prosperity. When Pinochet took control, Chile was in deep trouble. Inflation was sky high, the economy was stagnant, and there were food shortages and strikes all over the country. To fix things, Pinochet brought in a group of economists nicknamed the Chicago Boys, because they'd been trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman. Their plan was radical for the time: free market reforms, privatization, deregulation, and slashing government spending. It was a shock to the system, literally. They called it shock therapy economics. At first, it hurt. Inflation went up even higher, unemployment soared, and ordinary Chileans struggled. But after a few brutal years, things started to turn around. Inflation dropped, foreign investment poured in, and Chile's economy began to grow steadily. By the 1980s, Chile had one of the most open and competitive economies in Latin America. Exports increased, industries modernized, and poverty rates began to fall. Economists often point to Pinochet's reforms as the reason Chile became one of the region's most stable and prosperous countries in the decades that followed. Even after democracy returned, later governments, including left-leaning ones, kept many of the free market policies in place because they worked. Of course, none of this erases the human cost of Pinochet's rule. Thousands of people were tortured or killed by his regime, and political freedoms were severely restricted. Critics argue that the economic success came at too high a price, that you can't celebrate growth while ignoring the repression that came with it. Others argue that without his economic policies, Chile might never have broken out of the cycle of inflation and stagnation that plagued much of Latin America. It's one of those messy historical legacies where both things can be true at once. Pinochet was a dictator who committed human rights abuses, and he also stabilized an economy that was on the brink of collapse. Today, Chile is one of the wealthiest and most developed countries in the region, and its economic model is still studied around the world. Whether you love or hate Pinochet, his impact is undeniable. He left behind a country that, for better or worse, was fundamentally changed.
Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is one of the most iconic and polarizing figures of the 20th century. To some, He was a revolutionary hero who stood up to the United States and gave Cuba independence from foreign domination. To others, he was a dictator who crushed dissent, jailed opponents, and drove thousands of Cubans to flee the island. But here's a part of his legacy that's hard to ignore. Castro turned Cuba into a global powerhouse of medical diplomacy, sending thousands of doctors abroad to provide free health care. Castro's government invested heavily in medical education, building schools and training doctors by the tens of thousands. Healthcare became a cornerstone of the Cuban Revolution, free, universal, and available to everyone on the island. But Castro didn't stop at Cuba's borders. Starting in the 1960s, he began sending Cuban doctors to countries in need, from newly independent African nations to disaster zones in Latin America. These weren't small teams. We're talking entire brigades of doctors, nurses, and medical supplies sent to treat communities with no access to health care. Over the decades, Cuba has dispatched tens of thousands of medical professionals to more than 150 countries. They've worked in remote villages, treated victims of earthquakes, fought Ebola outbreaks, and even helped after Hurricane Katrina in the U.S., though the offer was declined at the time. One of the most famous missions was in 2014 when Cuba sent over 400 health workers to West Africa to fight the Ebola epidemic. International health officials praised the effort, saying Cuba sent more doctors per capita than almost any other country. For a small island nation under heavy economic sanctions, it was an astonishing show of global solidarity. Of course, critics argued that these missions weren't purely altruistic. Some called them medical diplomacy, saying they were a way for Castro to win political allies and project Cuban influence abroad. Others point out that doctors on these missions were often paid very little, while the Cuban government profited. Still, for the patients who got free surgeries, vaccinations, and life-saving treatment, the politics didn't matter. They were alive because the Cubans showed up. Inside Cuba, healthcare became one of the revolution's biggest achievements. Despite being a poor country, Cuba boasts high life expectancy and low infant mortality rates, rivaling much wealthier nations. That emphasis on medicine made it possible to sustain overseas missions for decades. So yes, Fidel Castro was a one-party ruler who clamped down on freedom of speech and left a complicated legacy. But he also made Cuba synonymous with medical aid, turning doctors into ambassadors and making health care a kind of soft power. Love him or hate him, there are people all over the world who owe their lives to a Cuban doctor sent by Castro's government.
Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il, the late leader of North Korea, is mostly remembered for running one of the most secretive and repressive regimes in the world. This is the guy who built a cult of personality so intense that state media claimed he shot 11 holes in one the first time he ever played golf. But here's the strange twist. Under Kim Jong-il's rule, North Korea actually made moves, at least on paper, to promote women's rights. Officially, the North Korean government has one of the most
progressive-sounding constitutions when it comes to gender equality. It guarantees equal rights for women in education, employment, and politics. During Kim Jong-il's era, the state kept up the narrative that women were an essential part of the socialist project. Propaganda posters showed women as doctors, engineers, farmers, and soldiers, standing shoulder to shoulder with men in building the country. The government even passed laws banning arranged marriages, outlawing polygamy, and guaranteeing maternity leave and child care support. In theory, women had the right to work, the right to divorce, and the right to participate in all levels of government. Kim Jong-il himself would regularly praise women as flowers of the nation and encourage them to get an education and contribute to the workforce. And here's the thing. Some of this actually made a difference. North Korea's literacy rate for women is extremely high, nearly 100%. Women became doctors, teachers, scientists, and held seats in the Supreme People's Assembly. Though, to be fair, that assembly doesn't exactly debate anything. But, as with everything in North Korea, there's a catch. The rights existed mostly in propaganda and policy documents, not always in daily life. Women were still expected to do most of the housework, raise children, and in many cases, participate in forced labor campaigns. There were strict rules about how women could dress, wear their hair, and behave in public. And speaking out against the government, whether you were male or female, was still a fast track to a labor camp. Still, the official stance on women's rights mattered. It put girls in schools, kept women in the workforce, and gave at least some legal framework that, compared to other parts of the region in the mid-20th century, was surprisingly forward-looking. In a country where the state controls every part of life, those policies meant millions of women grew up literate and trained for work outside the home. So yes, Kim Jong-il was a dictator who ruled through fear and censorship. But under his leadership, North Korea continued to promote gender equality, at least in principle. It's one of those strange cases where a regime known for oppression also pushed an agenda that, in some ways, genuinely improved women's opportunities, even if it was partly for propaganda. It still left a mark.